Chapter 2136. The sun was setting in the west, shining on Borealis City. In a small courtyard in the city, a young man was lying on a rattan chair, looking very relaxed. Another young man, on the other hand, pulled a wooden stool over and sat next to him, grinning from ear to ear, looking at the setting sun. Xiaoyang yawned as well, looking very tired. His face was full of helplessness. Sitting next to him with a sinister look on his face was, of course, unrivaled God, who had already consolidated his fourth spiritual meridian. When he came here, he already knew in his heart that the battle was unavoidable. But in the end, it ended up in such a way, which was somewhat unexpected. At least to unrivaled God, it was a little too dramatic. He did not even understand why things turned out this way. Looking at his friend, who had become quite dispirited, he couldn't help but smile and laugh loudly. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, glared at unrivaled God, hoping that he would restrain himself. However, unrivaled God's laughter grew even wilder. He did not want to laugh, but he could not help it when he saw the ending. He even laughed out loud. Xiaoyang really couldn't do anything to this friend of his, who was always serious and didn't mind watching a show. In fact, he even suspected that the reason why Princess Mingzhu was so determined to fight with him was because this guy did not fan the flames at the start of the battle. They were not on opposite sides to begin with, and they were even allies. However, the battle had already begun. Towards the end, it had even changed. It had almost become a battle of life and death. Of course, both of them were at fault for the way things had turned out. Perhaps it was because of their competitive mentality that they had developed inexplicable emotions, which led to such an ending. It had already happened, and it was a foregone conclusion. There was no point in pursuing the matter now. Therefore, he could only lie there and sigh. There was nothing he could do. I say, if you want to fight, then fight. It's normal for young couples to flirt. But what did you do to provoke that girl? Look, there's not a single piece of unscathed skin on your body. There are sword marks everywhere. Even your heart has been pierced. You don't have to be so cruel, unrivaled God teased. Xiaoyang did not want to finish his sentence, so he continued to glare at him. However, unrivaled God did not restrain himself at all. He ignored the threat in unrivaled God's eyes. Anyway, I'll show you. No matter how capable you are, you don't have to kill me with your eyes. Are you just going to let her do this? This is just the beginning. If you continue to be so forbearing, won't you be lawless in the future? You're lucky that you stopped in time. Otherwise, you might have lost your life. Unrivaled God chuckled. Xiaoyang naturally knew this as well, but what could he do? Sometimes he had no choice but to compromise. Moreover, after he had broken through to the martial royal realm, he was restricted everywhere in the 3,000 small worlds. He did not dare to use his full strength at all. This made him feel very helpless. After all, if the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation was attracted for the sake of a competition, the consequences would be extremely terrifying. If they were mortal enemies, unrivaled God would not hesitate to kill them with lightning speed. However, they were not mortal enemies. Strictly speaking, they were allies. There was no need for them to go that far. Unrivaled God was a little frustrated when he saw that Xiaoyang did not say anything. This friend of his was not a good friend. He did not even respond. Or had he been beaten senseless? Unrivaled God was only aware of the battle between Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu. However, he did not know how the battle had progressed. More than that, he had deduced some clues from Xiaoyang's injuries after seeing him. However, that was not the whole picture. It was just a rough guess. Therefore, unrivaled God wanted to fish for information. He wanted to understand how the battle had progressed. When the two of them returned, Princess Mingzhu immediately picked a room to rest. She looked furious. Clearly, she had won a great victory. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, looked dispirited. His body was covered in wounds. It was obvious that he had suffered a lot. The chances of him being defeated were very high. I have to say, your body is really tough. You managed to suppress such serious injuries in just a few hours. Now, you're in the mood to enjoy the sunset. Lei Dingtian of the Thousand Thunder Realm has always been known for his tough body. However, I'm afraid he's not even 1/10 as strong as you are now. Unrivaled God did not care about Xiaoyang's current state of mind and emotions. He continued probing with his words. He was too curious about the battle. That was why he was trying to fish for information. He wanted to know the whole picture and what had happened. However, Xiaoyang seemed to have cultivated a silent meditation. No matter how much Unrivaled God tried to fish for information, he did not say a word. He had everything under control. Unrivaled God was rather helpless now that things had come to this. However, his curiosity made him unwilling to give up so easily. It's not that I want to criticize you, but what's there to be stingy about? Or did you really do something shameful? Is that why you don't want to tell me? Unrivaled God had a shameless look on his face. Today, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. If you don't tell me, then I'll keep nagging in your ear and you won't be able to rest in peace. Of course, since you've caught my fancy, I'll serve you well. That's not a problem at all. If Xiaoyang still had any strength left, he would have thrown this guy out of the drifting cloud realm right away. However, after suffering that strike, the injuries within his body were rather severe. Coupled with the suppression of the energy of the Grand Tao, he had no choice but to weigh the pros and cons. He could only swallow his anger and allow his good friend to ceaselessly cry out by his ear like a fly. After a few words, Xiaoyang's attitude remained the same. There was not much change. As a result, Unrivaled God was infuriated. This fellow was completely impervious to everything. Could it be that it was so difficult for him to open his mouth and explain what was going on? Unrivaled God was helpless. Driven by curiosity, his heart felt like it was being bitten by hundreds of ants. It was unbearably itchy. However, Xiaoyang did not say a word, which made him lose his appetite completely, making him feel very uncomfortable. Chapter 2137. Princess Mingzhu sat alone in the room, lost in thought. She could not help but recall the battle with Xiaoyang outside the flowing cloud realm. Why did his fist, which had been raised, not land at the last moment? In fact, she could clearly sense that the might of that punch was incomparably terrifying. If it landed, even if her head did not explode, she would be severely injured and die even if it landed on her chest. The battle between the two of them had already reached such a stage. But why did that punch not land? And how exactly did he manage to retract and release it so freely and effortlessly? If that punch landed, she would be the one to lose. However, he did not do that. Therefore, Princess Mingzhu could not figure it out. If that punch landed, Xiaoyang would be at the top of the younger generation in the 3,000 small worlds. However, he did not do that. After thinking about it for a long time, she still could not figure out why. After struggling for a long time, Princess Mingzhu walked out. She pushed the door open and saw that it was already late at night. The bright moon hung high in the sky. Xiaoyang was still lying on the rattan chair, rocking back and forth, resting with his eyes closed. Shen Wushuang, who was sitting beside him, seemed to be tired of talking. He wanted to rest for a while before continuing to interrogate. However, as for whether the final result would satisfy him, that was still a huge problem. He wasn't sure about that either. However, when Shen Wushuang saw Princess Mingzhu walk out, he already had an idea in his heart. Perhaps the answer would be revealed soon. Princess Mingzhu slowly walked over. She looked at the young man. Even though he was heavily injured, he still had a carefree and relaxed look on his face. He looked incomparably pleased. It was as if those injuries were just superficial wounds, not worth mentioning. This kind of calmness and composure really made people unable to figure out what was going on. Could it be that he was an old fox who had lived for 10,000 years? Was that why he did not show his emotions on his face? You could have won that punch. Why didn't you land it? Princess Mingzhu frowned and questioned. Since she could not figure it out, she would just ask. Princess Mingzhu's thoughts were very simple. She just wanted to know the answer. If the other party had any improper thoughts about him, it would be good to get rid of those thoughts. Hearing these words, Xiao Yang's eyebrows furrowed slightly. He felt that such a question was really a little strange, and it made him confused. Unrivaled God, on the other hand, was completely focused on the task at hand. He was even more serious than Lin Huang when he was cultivating. He felt that Xiao Yang had shown mercy at the last moment. It seemed like he really had something up his sleeve. Whether or not the answer was the same as what he thought was still a question. However, Unrivaled God felt that this was most likely the case. After all, men understood men better. What do you think is the reason? Xiao Yang laughed disdainfully as he asked. This attitude made the anger in Princess Mingzhu's heart almost burst out. What did he mean by such an attitude? Wasn't this a little too much? At the very least, she found it hard to accept. All along, Princess Mingzhu had always had a condescending attitude toward her peers. The other party's actions naturally made it difficult for him to remain calm. Your cultivation talent is indeed extraordinary. However, at the end of the day, your brain isn't working very well, Xiao Yang said with a wry smile. Princess Mingzhu's aura skyrocketed when she heard these words. He was obviously saying that she was brainless and that she was an idiot. This was extremely disrespectful. For a moment, the corner of Unrivaled God's mouth twitched involuntarily. This guy really dared to say anything, and he had a fearless look on his face. What an iron-headed guy. However, sometimes quarrelsome foes were born this way. Perhaps there was a good show to watch later. Unrivaled God reached out and touched the table a few times, but it was empty. There were no melon seeds, which made him feel a little disappointed. Believe it or not, if my punch really landed, not only would your head explode, but even your body would be smashed into pieces, Xiao Yang said with a cold laugh. Princess Mingzhu frowned slightly when she heard this. She was a little hesitant about whether or not this was true. After all, the punch did not land. Therefore, she really did not know how terrifying the punch's power was. So what? Princess Mingzhu said coldly. Xiao Yang laughed when he heard this. He thought it was ridiculous. Unrivaled God, on the other hand, frowned slightly. He found it rather unbelievable. It was indeed a little funny that she could say something like that. Unrivaled God lost all interest all of a sudden. Initially, he thought that the two of them were on the same level as each other. However, who knew that their states of mind were not on the same level at all? Mingzhu, you're too obsessed with cultivation. This is both a good and a bad thing. Unrivaled God sighed helplessly and said. However, Princess Mingzhu glared at Unrivaled God, telling him to shut up. Unrivaled God could not help but be speechless. It was not strange that such a temperament was born from too much praise. However, he still found it difficult to accept. What she did was truly ridiculous. So what? Then you'll be dead. When that happens, even if the heavenly realm has the ability to use your God soul to reconstruct a physical body, it will still be at your peak. However, by then will your cultivation base still be at this level? Xiao Yang said coldly. Princess Mingzhu frowned. In a contest, one would be responsible for one's own life and death. What was there to worry about? Seeing that she was still unconvinced, Xiao Yang shook his head helplessly. This woman, who was hailed as the hope of the heavenly realm, did not let them down. Her talent was high and her progress was fast. It was shocking. However, a cultivator was not only about cultivation, but also how they interacted with others. The higher one's cultivation base was, the more cautious one had to be when dealing with others. A person without great strength would only cause chaos in a small place at most. However, a martial emperor was enough to cause chaos in a place. As for this place, it was a world of its own. It was no longer a small town or a small city. The number of people who were implicated was uncountable. unrivaled god, on the other hand, covered his face with his hand, looking as if he did not know this girl. Up to this point, Princess Mingju's cultivation path was indeed enough to figure out a rough idea. This was the negligence of the heavenly realm. They had given her all the good stuff, but it was only limited to cultivation. Chapter 2138. Now that things had developed to this day, when Princess Mingju had to step up and take charge of things on her own, her imperfections were completely exposed. Especially when she was extremely prideful, it was easy for her to overlook many things and details, exposing herself even more thoroughly. Unrivaled God felt helpless now, but there was nothing he could do. Princess Mingju was used to being arrogant and willful. If she had been calm in the past, he would have been able to talk to her. However, her emotions were so unstable now. If he were to say a few words, it would only add fuel to the fire. As for the alliance, it was an extremely important matter. Now, Unrivaled God was in a dilemma. He was speechless. At first, he thought that Princess Mingju did not know the way, or that the Emperor God took pity on him and sent him to visit an old friend. However, who would have thought that something like this would happen? At the end of the day, Xiaoyang was still worried about Qi Nan's presence. It seems that the high and mighty Princess Mingju doesn't understand the ways of the world, Xiaoyang said with a sarcastic smile. Princess Mingju could not help but frown as soon as he said that. In her opinion, these words were still inexplicable. Why did he say that? What was the point of doing so? If I really killed the princess of the God realm, wouldn't our alliance be a joke? Moreover, the Emperor God has built up the momentum to such an extent. Every step he takes can be said to be filled with trepidation. He doesn't dare to slack off in the slightest. He's afraid that some accident will happen and cause the great plan of 10,000 years to go down the drain because of some small problem, Xiaoyang said coldly. If Xiaoyang really did land that punch, he would naturally be the winner. However, Princess Mingju would also die. When that happened, the God realm and the drifting cloud realm would definitely fall out. When that happened, with the temperament of the God realm, they would definitely start a war. When that happened, the war between the two realms would probably involve even more mini-worlds. When that happened, both sides would inevitably suffer great losses in the flames of war. As for the so-called plan, it would all go down the drain and be destroyed overnight. This was something that Xiaoyang did not expect. Princess Mingju did not have any understanding of the ways of the world. If you continue to be so willful, I think it won't be long before the God realm falls into your hands, Xiaoyang said coldly. Princess Mingju frowned. It could be said that she was still tangled and obsessed with the details of that battle and had not considered the overall situation. Now that he thought about it, was he really wrong? Such a rash approach would indeed add countless obstacles to his father's plan. Was it really worth it to do everything so decisively just for a single breath? Princess Mingju's heart began to waver. That was because she really couldn't figure out the reason for her actions. At least from the looks of it, his previous thoughts seemed to be wrong. In fact, they were very excessive. Xiaoyang laughed when he saw that Princess Mingju seemed to be a little autistic. All of a sudden, he realized that it was impossible for the God Emperor to be completely unaware of his daughter's nature. However, he still allowed her to come despite knowing this. His motive was very obvious. He wanted to use Xiaoyang to dampen the spirit of this blessed daughter of heaven. He wanted her to know that some things were equally important and could not be missed. After coming up with such thoughts and inferences, Xiaoyang felt a little uncomfortable. He was completely being used as a tool. If you can't accept this, you should return to the God realm as soon as possible. Moreover, you've already won anyway. Why think so much? Xiaoyang said. The corners of Unrivaled God's mouth could not help but twitch when he heard this. Xiaoyang was probably the only one who could say something so straightforward and disrespectful. She was a blessed daughter of heaven who was high above the masses. In the God realm, she was worshipped by countless people. Today, She had been reprimanded as if she was worthless in front of him. Unrivaled God glanced at Princess Mingzhu from the corner of his eye and realized that her expression had turned very bad. It was as if she had indeed suffered a great setback. It was as if all her previous pride was now gone. She was like a joke. However, he did not open his mouth to say anything. Instead, he kept his mouth shut. After all, there were some things that could not be said. He had to observe the situation. Faced with two martial emperors, he still had to mediate. Was this not making things difficult for him? Only now did unrivaled God realize that what he had received was not a leisurely and pleasant task at all. It was a disaster of monstrous proportions. Stuck in the middle, it seemed that no matter which side he helped, it would not make sense. "I've lost," Princess Mingzhu said faintly after a long while, then turned around and left. When Princess Mingzhu turned around, her face was full of loneliness. She now realized that she had lost completely. It was the same no matter where she was. After careful comparison, she realized that the gap between herself and Xiaoyang was so terrifying. There was a world of difference between their status and the resources they had. She was a blessed girl, but he was publicly acknowledged as a bumpkin. However, she was no match for him now. That was the case in terms of battle, and the gap between them in terms of conduct was even greater. She had asked for countless resources in her own world, but what did she get in return? No matter how hard she thought about it, Princess Mingzhu could not figure it out. It seemed that she was only famous for her reputation. She could barely remember what she had done. Looking at Xiaoyang again, so what if he was a bumpkin? He had ascended from the lowest level of the inferior level to this place, but everything he had done was for his own world. He had been constantly feeding back to his own world, which was how he had earned his current reputation as Lord Xiao. All of this was not because he was the most powerful person in the drifting cloud world. Of course, a large part of the reason was that he had done a lot for this world. He had allowed a small world that was originally in decline to develop to its current state. He had even given birth to a spirit vein that belonged to his own world. He had benefited all the cultivators in the world. With such great achievements, the title of Common Lord was truly worthy of admiration. It was probably the same for being a person of virtue and prestige. However, the more she compared herself to him, the more depressed Princess Mingzhu felt. It was as if he was nothing at all in this case. She was just a flower that had grown up in a greenhouse. She was nothing. Chapter 2139. This conversation also ended because of Princess Mingzhu's departure. Shen Wushuang wanted to say something, but stopped himself. In the end, he did not say anything because he knew what he had to say to change the situation. Perhaps this was between the two of them, and he did not have to say anything. All he had to do was watch, and that was enough. The God Emperor must have had his reasons for making such arrangements. At least, he could not say anything more since he had no good way to salvage the situation. Xiaoyang and Shen Wushuang sat in the courtyard for a long time before returning to their rooms to rest. On the morning of the second day, Xiaoyang once again laid down on the rattan chair and continued rocking back and forth. He was in an indescribable mood. It was as if everything that had happened in this small courtyard yesterday had completely disappeared. Xiaoyang's temperament was just like that. He would not cause trouble for others. Some problems needed to be thought about quietly alone. It would be better if he could think it through. If he could not think it through himself, there was nothing he could do. Soon, Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai arrived and began to report the changes in the drifting cloud realm these days. We'll be pushing the drifting cloud realm to the God realm soon. It's inevitable that there will be some changes when the time comes. You have to calm everyone down, Xiaoyang instructed after listening to the report. Sun Yukai nodded with a smile and said, "Don't worry, Master. It's just a small matter. We can guarantee that there won't be any problems with this." Xiaoyang only nodded slightly and waved his hand to dismiss the two of them. It could be said that the alliance between the drifting cloud realm and the god realm had raised the spirits of many cultivators in the drifting cloud realm, because what they saw was an incomparably bright future that could reach the heavens in a single step. As for those who were unwilling to accept reality, they could leave. With a thought, Xiaoyang got up and left where he was. When he appeared again, he was in the demon tribe's territory. Since he had friends here, he naturally had to come and bid them farewell. After all, they might never see each other again after he left this time. After seeing their old friends, many of them were very excited, while some of them were incomparably resentful. They complained about why Xiaoyang hadn't come to see them and had been missing for so long. After explaining everything clearly and reminiscing about old times, he left behind a gift and headed to the demon realm. It was because of Xiaoyang that Scala, the number 2 figure in the realm of demons, could have such a high position and power. Even those demons in the demon realm felt that Scala was just a puppet that was supported by demon realm. However, over these years, Scala was not restrained at all. On the contrary, he became more and more powerful and even showed signs of surpassing the real demon lord. At the sight of Xiaoyang, Scala directly knelt down on the ground. Although the devil realm and the drifting cloud realm had been fighting each other, Scala was not belligerent. Therefore, after receiving Xiaoyang's support, he was extremely grateful to his benefactor. "Master," Scala said respectfully. Although Scala was now the most powerful demon in the realm of demons, he had always been grateful to Xiaoyang for recognizing his worth. Previously, he had heard some news and wanted to go to the drifting cloud realm to check it out. However, he was delayed because of the evil intentions of the mansion masters. Of course, he had been inquiring about the changes in the drifting cloud realm. "You're already the number 2 figure in the realm of demons. If other demons see you like this, it'll be a scandal," Xiaoyang said as he immediately helped Scala up. Scala shook his head and said, "It doesn't matter what other demons think. Scala's feelings for you will never change." Xiaoyang, on the other hand, laughed bitterly. He didn't expect this demon to be such a loyal and grateful person. In this way, Xiaoyang was quite happy. At least he had not misjudged Scala. It was the right choice to hand over the realm of demons to him. After explaining the purpose of his visit, Xiaoyang left some things behind and left. Scala said that he had something to offer, but was rejected by Xiaoyang in the end. Looking at Xiaoyang's back view, Scala became silent. He knew that this would probably be the last time they would see each other. After bidding farewell to his friends in the demon realm and demon realm, Xiaoyang returned to the drifting cloud realm and sat on his rattan chair. As for Princess Mingzhu's attitude, and whether or not she had figured out the crux of the matter, that was not something Xiaoyang needed to concern himself with. After all, he had done what he could. As for when the drifting cloud realm would set off, it was not up to Xiaoyang to decide. He still needed the world spirit to make arrangements. Perhaps because Princess Mingzhu was in the drifting cloud realm, the world spirit had to be careful in everything it did to avoid being discovered by outsiders. Therefore, it was inevitable that its movements would be slower. Of course, this was a grand plan to begin with. Sometimes there was no point in rushing for time. The most important thing was how to make this matter go smoothly. Soon, Unrivaled God walked over and sat next to Xiaoyang, saying, "Should we continue waiting?" They had already wasted a lot of time, but the formation he had brought had yet to be deployed. If they delayed any longer, they would inevitably be delayed. At the same time, there was nothing Unrivaled God could do. If they relied on Xiaoyang's strength alone, it would be a little difficult to move the drifting cloud realm. Meanwhile, Princess Mingzhu had locked herself in her room for more than 10 days and had not shown her face. No one knew what she was thinking or what she was planning to do. Caught in the middle, Unrivaled God made countless inferences himself, hoping to mediate. However, in the end, he could only sigh. This kind of thing was not something that could be explained in a few words. "What else can we do?" Xiaoyang said with a wry smile. Unrivaled God looked over and realized that there were faint marks on the back of Xiaoyang's hand. Obviously, he had not fully recovered from the injuries he had sustained in that battle. It seemed that the matter of moving the world could not be rushed. Unrivaled God felt very powerless now. He had taken on a heavy responsibility, but in the end, it seemed like there was nothing he could do. This feeling could be said to be incomparably aggrieved. Even he felt a little uncomfortable. Chapter 2140. In the first year of the new era, the drifting cloud realm was officially launched into the God realm. It could be said that this was the first major event recorded since the new era was launched. This was because this event would change the drifting cloud realm's position and concept. This was also the beginning of breaking away from the 3,000 small worlds and ascending to the 3,000 medium worlds. It would not be an exaggeration to say that this was a huge milestone. For this matter, the entire flowing cloud realm had been struggling for more than 10 years. In the end, they had taken the first step as they wished, and the person who had done all this was Xiaoyang. After receiving the news from the world spirit, Xiaoyang simply announced the matter and gave Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai 10 days to make arrangements. He then took action. If he had only relied on brute force to push it, Xiaoyang would not have been able to do it alone. However, with the help of the world spirit, it would be much simpler. Therefore, Xiaoyang only needed to contribute a small part of his strength. If he was not worried about being discovered, he could even lie down on his rattan chair and rest. There was no need for him to put on an act here. Meanwhile, Unrivaled God was still clueless about this. Although the world was moving, he did not feel it. It was also because he had been in the small courtyard all this time that he was not very well informed about the outside world. Therefore, he had no idea what was going on right now. However, he had not seen Xiaoyang for a few days. He did not know where he had gone, which was very strange. At this juncture, could it be that Xiaoyang was throwing a tantrum as well? These two were almighty martial emperors. He should be more tolerant and not make things difficult for himself. With that thought in mind, Unrivaled God returned to his room and continued to sulk and sulk. Xiaoyang stood in the endless void. He carefully pushed the drifting cloud realm forward. This was because he knew very well that if he moved too quickly, the world's main body would inevitably be affected by some fluctuations. In the best-case scenario, the earth would shake and the mountains would shake, causing countless living beings to suffer. If things got serious, many good places might be destroyed in an instant. After walking for a while, Xiaoyang saw Scala and some of his friends in the demon realm behind him. It was as if they had long known about this and had been waiting here for a long time just to send Xiaoyang off. Looking at his former friends, Xiaoyang smiled and said, "If everyone is willing, why don't you join the flowing cloud world and head to the middle world together?" Xiaoyang trusted the nature of these friends. "Master, I've already discussed this with my friends in the demon realm. Our two worlds have already formed an alliance, and we will advance with the goal of becoming a medium world. Master, just wait over there. We will meet again one day," Scala said loudly. Seeing that the other party rejected his good intentions, Xiaoyang smiled and nodded. Of course, it was a good thing that they had such aspirations. Perhaps they would never be able to reach such a goal in their entire lives. However, having such a mindset was enough to allow them to walk further on the path of cultivation. As long as one was a cultivator, one had to have a goal. If one didn't have a goal, what was the difference between one and a salted fish? After the friends in the demon realm and the monster realm sent him off, they turned back and returned to their own worlds. Xiaoyang smiled faintly and put this matter aside. He continued to push the flowing cloud world forward. As Xiaoyang walked further and further, some cultivators saw how he pushed the entire world with his own power. After seeing this scene, every cultivator was undoubtedly very shocked. At the same time, they were very impressed. What kind of powerhouse could push a world? This caused countless people to be puzzled and even feel that it was extremely strange. However, they didn't ask rashly for fear of offending that powerhouse. That said, there were more and more different opinions regarding this matter. Many people were very curious about what was going on. In this vast galaxy, There were countless rumors about this. In the flowing cloud world, although the entire world was being pushed, the people in the world didn't feel anything strange. Everything was the same as before. It was as if nothing had happened. Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin stood on top of North Light City. They looked at each other and smiled. Before Xiaoyang left to push the flowing cloud world, they had returned from the distant South Grotto Heaven and the North Peak Grotto Heaven, respectively, to guard this place in case anything happened while Xiaoyang was away. With their abilities, they could barely handle it. As for Ji Fei, he was still spreading the news about the other worlds to the cultivators of the flowing cloud world and what they needed to pay attention to. It was so much so that when the flowing cloud realm arrived at the God realm, he even wrote 3 books, respectively introducing the God realm, the Sword Heart realm, and the Snow Sun realm. He explained many customs and things to pay attention to so that when the time came for the meeting, some misunderstandings would cause some unhappiness. The new era had begun, and the flowing cloud world had finally walked out of the haze of the catastrophe tens of thousands of years ago. It was no longer a small world that was constantly falling. Sun Dishing and Sun, Yukai, didn't go to the small courtyard again. They naturally knew that the distinguished guests of the God realm were there. But Lord Xiao had told them not to disturb them. If the other party had any requests, they would try their best to satisfy them. No matter how big or small the matter was, the 2 heroes of the Sun family handled it even more appropriately. Xiao Man's cultivation had also risen to the 7th level of King Wu. Her speed was even more shocking. When this news spread, the world was instantly shocked. At the same time, many people realized that although Xiao Man was only a servant girl, she was Lord Zhao's servant girl. The resources she had were naturally not to be underestimated. Her cultivation speed was so fast that it was almost comparable to Qian Guangqi. Some other geniuses seemed to have begun to emerge and stand out because of the start of the new era. Of course, this wasn't a groundless rumor without a reason. This was all because of the appearance of the world's spiritual veins. The world's spiritual veins contained not only spiritual energy, but also luck. It could be said that the appearance of the world's spiritual veins was enough to cause a qualitative change in a world. Why did the God realm have 6 spots out of the 9 martial emperors and now 7? This was inextricably linked to the 2 world spirit veins, which was why it was like this. Chapter 2141. More than 10 days had passed, and Xiaoyang seemed to have vanished without a trace. This caused unrivaled God to panic a little. Could it be that this fellow was throwing a tantrum and was ready to quit? Xiao Meng, where did your young master go? Unrivaled God asked impatiently. Xiao Meng shook her head innocently. After making sure that she had wiped the rattan chair clean, she said, I haven't seen the young master since I came out of closed-door cultivation. I don't know where he's gone now. Unrivaled God's lungs were about to explode when he heard this. Now his heart was filled with great displeasure, and he could no longer suppress his anger. Forming an alliance and advancing to the middle world together was such a big deal. Now they were throwing tantrums. Was this really appropriate? At least, Unrivaled God did not think it was appropriate. He had tolerated them before because he put himself in their shoes and understood each other. However, there had to be a limit to all of this. Now that he was ignoring everything, it was a bit too much. Therefore, Unrivaled God could not take it anymore. He wanted to scold the 2 of them. Soon after, Unrivaled God strode toward Princess Mingzhu's room aggressively. It could be said that she was the cause of all the problems. If they did not clear things up today, there was no telling how long they would have to drag this on. Therefore, this matter had to be resolved now. However, Unrivaled God had only taken a few steps when the door was opened. Princess Mingzhu was still wearing a plain white dress with a white veil covering her face. She looked like an otherworldly fairy. This was Xiao Meng's first time seeing Princess Mingzhu. Even though she was a woman, she could not help but be infatuated. She felt that her aura was intoxicating. If there was anything lacking, it would be that her aura was a little sharp and unapproachable. Just as Unrivaled God was about to open his mouth to curse, Princess Mingzhu shot into the sky in a flash. "Hey, you're still throwing a tantrum, aren't you?" Unrivaled God mumbled unhappily and immediately chased after her. Unrivaled God's patience had reached its limit in the face of serious matters. "So what if you're Princess Mingzhu? Since you did something wrong, then you have to bear the consequences." After the two of them left, Xiao Man still stood there in a daze. After a long while, he finally regained his senses. With a bitter smile, he lowered his head. An inexplicable feeling arose in her heart, as if she was ashamed of her inferiority. When Mu Yang and Chu Tain, who were overseeing the North Light City, saw white light and a golden light shooting out, the two of them smiled helplessly. They knew that those two were the Almighty of the God world. As for what had happened before, he had heard a little about it. Since Xiaoyang had told them not to bother about it, they naturally let them be. "I've heard that Princess Mingzhu is very naive. She's the favored daughter of the 3,000 small worlds. I wonder if that's true." Muyang thought for a while and smiled. Chu Tain smiled and nodded. "That shouldn't be bad. I just don't know if our Lord will have a chance." When Muyang heard this, the two of them looked at each other in tacit understanding and laughed out loud. If such a wonderful thing really happened, then the situation that the flowing cloud world was facing would once again undergo a huge change. However, this was just a fantasy and could not be confirmed. Therefore, the two of them did not care and continued to play chess. Unrivaled God chased after them, but Princess Mingzhu was simply too fast. When Unrivaled God caught up with Princess Mingzhu and saw everything before him clearly, he was shocked. This was because what he saw was a young man pushing a world forward. Moreover, every step was very stable. There was not the slightest ripple. After witnessing this scene, Unrivaled God and Princess Mingzhu almost fell into a daze. This was because they thought that this was just too unbelievable. One must know that only two martial emperors working together could push a world. However, Xiaoyang had done it alone. Moreover, when he was doing all this, there was not the slightest ripple or surge in his world. This was the most unbelievable part. If the three martial emperors had not joined forces, how could it have been possible? Or was Xiaoyang really a monster? If Princess Mingzhu had not sensed something strange and rushed over to check, she would still be in the dark. Looking at the young man's back, Princess Mingzhu was also shocked. She felt that everything she saw before her eyes was unreal. The God Realm's formation had not been used, and Xiaoyang had carried out everything on his own. According to the time when that strange feeling appeared, more than 10 days had passed. Unrivaled God rubbed his eyes frantically and gulped. This was because he felt that what he was seeing was too unreal. What was all this for? This monster's ability was a little too terrifying. "How did you do it?" Unrivaled God asked after a long while. The anger he felt when he was denouncing Lin Huang earlier vanished without a trace at this moment. When he was still blaming Lin Huang, he did not know what was going on. "It's nothing. I have a formation that's more suitable for the drifting cloud realm, so I used it. I didn't expect the effect to be so extraordinary," Xiaoyang said with a smile. His tone was still as casual as ever, as if what he had done was effortless. Princess Mingzhu was completely shocked now. She had to admit that she had really lost. She had lost completely. No matter how she looked at it, she was inferior to Lin Huang. If he really had to say something, it would be that he was still the best existence in the world in terms of luck in the 3,000 small worlds. But what does that count as? At least in Princess Mingzhu's eyes, this was no longer something to be proud of. "I really didn't expect your ability to be so terrifying," Unrivaled God stammered a little. Xiaoyang was now a complete mystery to Unrivaled God. How many techniques did he know? Having seen the heavenly cycle formation before, Unrivaled God had no doubts about Xiaoyang's mastery of formations. But now he was still incomparably shocked. There were simply too many things that he found inconceivable. I've been pushing it for more than 10 days. I'm a little tired. Aren't you going to replace me for a while and let me rest? Xiao Yang looked back at Princess Mingzhu and said with a chuckle. It was as if his previous unhappiness had disappeared. Chapter 2142. Xiao Yang's tone was also very relaxed, as though everything was done casually. He even sounded a little lazy. The unhappiness from before had ended long ago, so there was no need to hold on to it. Moreover, Xiao Yang had also figured out some of the meaning behind this. The God Emperor sent Princess Mingzhu here, probably because the God realm could not spare any manpower. But at the same time, the God Emperor also knew his daughter's nature, and there were some problems with her state of mind. Therefore, he sent her here to let Xiao Yang temper her. It could also be said that this time Xiao Yang was used as a whetstone by the God Emperor. But thinking that the gift from the God realm was still quite generous, he did not continue to fuss over this matter. The ways of the world were like this. Sometimes one still had to turn a blind eye. If one were to haggle over every detail, then it would be lacking in humanity. Moreover, in the face of the big picture, what was a little bit of displeasure in one's heart? They were not hot-blooded youths, so it was impossible for them to fuss over everything and distinguish who was right or wrong. Princess Mingzhu was first stunned when she heard this. Then she immediately went over. When she pushed her hands forward, layers of halos appeared like ripples. It was very mysterious. It could be said that during this period of time, Princess Mingzhu's state of mind had undergone too many changes. Therefore, many things had naturally been put down, and she had also thought things through. She might be an existence that controlled the God realm in the future. If she did things based on her own preferences, then things would really be a mess. Her father, the God Emperor, was very powerful. He had always disliked the old Prime Minister's line, and there were even many conflicts between them. If the God Emperor was willing, he could even uproot them. But he did not do so. How could it be so easy to control a world? Therefore, Princess Mingzhu's state of mind could be said to have started to change after experiencing many things in the flowing cloud realm. Everything was done subtly, or perhaps after that battle, the doubts in her heart had also started to sublimate, slowly and carefully. Otherwise, if you're not careful, even if my world only seems to tremble a little, I'm afraid countless people will suffer. Xiao Yang said very patiently and gently. Princess Mingzhu nodded slightly and carefully cooperated with Xiao Yang, afraid that something would go wrong. Sensing that this lass had begun to consider the big picture and was no longer as willful as before, Xiao Yang revealed a satisfied smile. This way, the God Emperor's goal would be achieved. As for the gifts he accepted, he naturally felt more at ease, as it was Princess Mingzhu's first time activating the world. She was still rather unfamiliar with it. As a result, Xiao Yang slowed down the pace. The handover took an entire incense stick's worth of time to complete. When Xiao Yang retreated from the array, he was already sweating profusely. It wasn't that he wasn't strong enough, but that his mind was too focused. As he said, if anything went wrong, it might be a huge disaster for the people of the flowing cloud realm. Therefore, he had to do his best. Fortunately, their cooperation was perfect, and there were no problems at all. After a few words of instructions, Xiao Yang and unrivaled God returned to the flowing cloud realm to rest. Xiao Yang might have been a little worried about this princess of the God realm before, but now that she had let go of all her pride and was working for the greater good of the world, she would definitely do her best. After lying down on the familiar rattan chair, Xiao Yang began to rock again. At the same time, he began to think about other problems in his mind. After the alliance with the God realm, it would be imperative for them to elevate to a medium world. If they succeeded, they would no longer be restricted by luck and would forever remain in King Wu's realm. However, at the same time, the problems they would face by then might become even more severe than before. Therefore, Xiao Yang was also thinking about these problems. How to deal with them when the time came was still a problem. Of course, these were things for the future. After the alliance and the integration of a few worlds, the most troublesome problem would be how to solve some of the minor conflicts caused by cultural differences. Although Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai had already come up with relevant policies on this matter, Sun Yang and Sun Yukai had already done so. Under the joint efforts of Ji Fei Muyang and the others, the results seemed to be quite good. However, when the day came, it was unknown whether the results would still be as good. At the very least, Xiaoyang had no idea. He couldn't tell if there would be any problems when the time came. Just as Xiaoyang was having a headache, a thumbs up quietly appeared. "You're really something. I can't believe you managed to tame Princess Mingzhu so obediently." Unrivaled God no longer held back and laughed out loud. Hearing this, Xiaoyang rolled his eyes at Unrivaled God. All this while, this guy seemed to think that there wasn't enough drama to stir up. It seemed like he wanted to add more fuel to the fire. "You're not a martial emperor yet. That's why you don't know the intricacies of this," Xiaoyang suddenly said with a grin. Unrivaled God could not help but frown when he saw this grin. Indeed, he was not a martial emperor yet, but Xiaoyang was the real deal. Unrivaled God could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. If his words were really heard by that girl, he was afraid he would have to suffer a little. Unrivaled God, who had been a little arrogant at first, could be said to have lost his temper at this moment. He looked left and right, looking guilty. Xiaoyang was happy to see him like this. Since Unrivaled God had the guts to say those words, he naturally had to bear the consequences. Of course, Xiaoyang's words were completely meant to tease Unrivaled God. No matter how powerful a martial emperor powerhouse was, there was still a limit. Moreover, Princess Mingzhu's attention was now all on how to promote the world. Why would she care about this? As Xiaoyang and the world spirit were one, he could see any part of the drifting cloud realm if he wanted to, and the other party did not use any means to conceal it. In addition, how important was it to promote the world? Even if Xiaoyang wasn't there, he was still keeping an eye on it all the time to prevent any accidents from happening. Chapter 2143. Needless to say, this trick was quite practical. Unrivaled God was so scared that he did not dare to speak. In fact, he didn't even dare to breathe loudly for fear that the unruly girl would hear him and beat him up again. At that time, he would really be in a difficult position to speak of. However, when Unrivaled God looked at Xiaoyang again, he still did not seem to care. Naturally, he began to grumble inwardly. "You're not scaring me, are you?" Unrivaled God asked in dissatisfaction. Xiaoyang yawned and said, "If you say so, then so be it. I didn't say otherwise. However, you'd better think it over carefully. After all, we don't know if Princess Mingzhu left any tricks in this little courtyard." Unrivaled God shuddered when he heard that. There were so many tricks in the God realm. There were thousands of them recorded in the God realm alone. Moreover, even Unrivaled God himself had some tricks up his sleeve. However, due to the distance, they seemed rather useless, so he had never used them. However, Princess Mingzhu was a martial emperor powerhouse. She might be able to pull off some tricks. "Xiaoyang, I've been good to you. You can't bite the hand that feeds you," Unrivaled God said anxiously as the corner of his mouth twitched a few times. Unrivaled God was really panicking now. That was why he said something like that. Of course, he wanted to test if Xiaoyang was lying to him. However, he could not figure out what Unrivaled God was trying to tell from Unrivaled God's expression. Because of this, he felt even more uncertain in his heart. "I'm timid. Don't scare me. If I'm scared to death, it'll damage the friendship between the God realm and the drifting cloud realm. You'd better think it over," Unrivaled God stuttered. Xiaoyang felt helpless as he looked at this friend who did not have a proper friend most of the time. "Yes, I'm just scaring you. I want you to shut up," Xiaoyang said honestly. On the contrary, Unrivaled God's worry did not lessen after telling the truth. Instead, it became even more serious. "If I really suffer, I'll go to the southern far Grotto Heaven and the northern peak Grotto Heaven. I'll make you bleed." Unrivaled God left after saying that. Xiao Yang did not bother him. He continued to look up at the Milky Way and began to think of his own plans. After thinking for a long time, Xiao Yang let Ji Fei, Chu Taiyin, and Baldi and Qin Mingho patrol the world to prevent unnecessary trouble. After all, a world that could move was a very shocking thing to other cultivators. When that happened, some people would sneak in. When to say the cultivators to intrude to the world. To the point to say it to the God, to say unrivaled God. To say God to unrivaled has God to God. What's more, these people's abilities were not bad. With more training, they might become independent existences in the future. After making these arrangements, Xiao Yang went to the middle peak and continued to plant some seeds so that they could take root and germinate, nourishing this almost withered land. After such a long period of nurturing, the middle peak gradually regained some vitality and spiritual energy. It was no longer as barren as before. However, the effect was not very good. The speed was very slow as well. It would take a long time for the land to recover completely. However, Xiao Yang was patient. After all, this was not something that could be done in a day. After everything was settled, Xiao Yang immediately went to Princess Mingzhu for the handover after careful calculations. To Xiao Yang, moving the world did not require much energy because he was the master of this world. He could even borrow energy. However, it was different for Princess Mingzhu. She could only move the world with her own strength. After Princess Mingzhu left, she looked exhausted. It could be seen that she had used up a lot of energy. After exchanging a few simple words, Princess Mingzhu quickly returned to the drifting cloud world to recuperate. In the God world, the God Emperor was leisurely making notes in the back garden. Suddenly, he saw a man in armor barging in. He looked over and saw Qin Wang running in anxiously. "Fourth brother, you are one of the 3 great kings after all. You have lived for almost 10,000 years. Why are you still so reckless?" The God Emperor said with some displeasure. The King of Qin simply chuckled and laughed in a simple and honest manner. The God Emperor could only laugh it off. He naturally knew what his 4th brother was thinking. "Have we arrived at the Sword Heart world?" the God Emperor asked. Qin Wang nodded quickly and said, "We have arrived at the estimated border. The old Prime Minister and that old man are busy with this matter. They will probably come back to see you in 3 days." The God Emperor glared at Qin Wang when he heard that. "Big brother, don't worry. The 2 of them are very reliable. I, on the other hand, am so impatient that I will end up ruining things," Qin Wang said. The God Emperor shook his head helplessly. He naturally knew what Qin Wang's motive for coming here was. It will probably take 3 months for the drifting cloud world to arrive. After all, there are only 2 of them, the God Emperor said. Qin Wang rolled his eyes and said, "If I go, won't it be soon?" After he finished speaking, King Qin chuckled. "Do you think I don't know what you are thinking? Do you really want to fight with Xiao Yang so much? Not to mention that you will be bullying the weak if you win. If you lose, how will you keep your face?" The God Emperor said. Qin Wang had always been using battles to nurture his fighting spirit. He was especially happy when he met a strong opponent. Among the 9 great martial emperors, half of them had fought with Qin Wang before. This guy was completely a battle maniac. It could be said that he was able to cultivate to the level he was at today because of his own punches. It is just a spar. Is it as serious as Big Brother makes it out to be? If I win, it is only reasonable. If I lose, then our ally will be a real treasure, Qin Wang said. The God Emperor shook his head helplessly when he heard that. Go ahead. I will not stop you. Remember, don't ruin things. After all, we have planned for so many years and have reached this crucial step. We cannot afford any mistakes, the God Emperor said with a sigh. Chapter 2144. Second year of the Xian Yuan, January. When the people of the drifting cloud realm found out that they were only a month away from the God realm, everyone cheered. At the same time, many people did not even know that their realm had moved from its original location. They did not notice anything, as if everything was normal. After the news spread, some almighties began to leave the drifting cloud realm to observe the grand occasion. Even the cultivators of the drifting cloud realm were shocked when they saw a moving realm. They even thought that it was something completely unbelievable. It was hard to believe. However, seeing was believing. It told them that everything was real and not fake. Because of this, everyone was even more shocked. This kind of extravagance was truly unbelievable. The movement of the world had not always been smooth. This was because there would be other realms blocking their way. If they chose to take a detour, they might have to spend more than 10 days. As such, in order to not affect the other worlds, Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu could only raise or lower the flowing cloud world in order to bypass it. This method could only be done by the two of them working together. No matter who it was, they would not be able to do it alone. The consequence of doing so was a great loss of energy. Princess Mingzhu, in particular, had to spend a full 7 days to barely recover. As a result, their journey would inevitably be delayed. Fortunately, with the help of the world spirit, the speed of their journey was increased to the maximum. The time they saved was still considerable. Of course, during this period, there were some cultivators from the outside world who wanted to gain some benefits from the drifting cloud realm. They came with great momentum, but in the end, they were beaten to a pulp by Mu Yang and unrivaled God. Even if Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu did not do anything, who below the level of martial emperor could challenge the two-peak Kingwu with 4 spiritual meridians. Moreover, there were other rank 9 powerhouses watching and helping. They did not give them any chance at all. The news of a moving realm spread like wildfire. However, as more and more forces were beaten up, the cultivators who were scheming could only keep their thoughts to themselves. They didn't dare to provoke any more misfortune. During this month, Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai had also made some statistics on the changes in the drifting cloud realm during the new era. Not to mention other things, in this 1 year it could be said that in this 1 year, many powerhouses had appeared. There were even geniuses who broke through 3 realms in a year. Now, the overall strength of the flowing cloud world had been raised to the level of Kingwu, who could dominate an area when he was only at the 5th level. Now he was only a core force. In this year, there was not a single Type 9 powerhouse, but Arctic Grey Feather and Lin Shuyun had broken through to King Wu's Type 8, filling the gap. The old Master Xiao and the other core members had also broken through to the 7th stage, and their strength was not to be underestimated. Of course, the happiest thing was that in the North Light City, among the younger generation disciples, there were already more than 30 King Wu's Type 6. This was only the improvement of the North Light City. In places like the Sun Sect, and the Dark Knight Sanctuary, because of the new era, countless geniuses had begun to emerge and stand out. Although this level of strength was still not enough in front of the God realm, it meant something different to the drifting cloud world. Moreover, with the appearance of the world's spirit vein, the overall strength of the drifting cloud world showed a rising trend. Of course, it was naturally impossible to catch up to the God realm. However, in the future, it could be said that it could be on par with the Sword Heart world and the Sun Snow world. That would not be a problem. The God realm could be said to be blessed by the heavens. In addition, it had tens of thousands of years of foundation. It was naturally impossible to catch up to this colossus in a short period of time without a monstrous opportunity. With such an outcome, Xiaoyang was very satisfied. After the statistics, the result was very simple. That was to pick out 100 disciples with the most outstanding talent and qualifications from the entire drifting cloud world, and receive 3 days of careful teaching from Xiaoyang. In these 3 days of teaching, there were 3 people who broke through one after another and reached King Wu's Type 7. They could be said to be the most outstanding among the younger generation. However, among the 3 people, there was not a single disciple from the North Light City. Regarding this, Xiaoyang did not mind. This was because his teaching this time was just to fill in the gaps. Moreover, everyone had their own path and opportunity. Sometimes, when the intention was right, success would follow naturally. If the opportunity did not come, even if a monstrous opportunity was placed in front of them, they might not be able to grasp it. As the matters came to an end, the entire drifting cloud world began to get on the right track. The things that everyone was originally shocked by now they already felt that it was nothing strange. On the other hand, Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu took turns every 3 days to push the drifting cloud world forward. As for Shen Wushuang, Muyang, and the others, they were responsible for protecting the drifting cloud world to prevent outsiders from invading. Although there were some disturbances in the beginning, they soon calmed down. Among the top powerhouses, the current lineup of the drifting cloud world was not bad. Not to mention that there were 4 Type 9 powerhouses in the local area. There were also 3 newcomers. Such a lineup was already terrifying. On this day, Xiaoyang felt a powerful aura coming towards him. Immediately, he could not help but frown subconsciously. This was because what he felt was an extremely strong battle intent. Moreover, the aura was even more terrifying. It was an aura that only a martial emperor powerhouse could emit. Coupled with such a strong battle intent, it was not difficult to guess who it was. In a short while, a man in a green robe came behind Xiaoyang. When he saw Xiaoyang pushing the entire world forward with his own power, his eyes were more or less filled with shock. "Senior Qinhuang, I didn't expect you to come so soon." Xiaoyang did not turn around to look and already knew who it was. After Xiaoyang defeated Wei Beixin, he received news from the Emperor God that Qinhuang wanted to fight with him. However, due to the difference in their cultivation levels, they had not been able to fight. The last time Qinhuang visited the drifting cloud world and returned to the God realm, he even specially revealed this idea. Therefore, the martial emperor who came at this critical juncture with the intention to fight could only be him. Chapter 2145. The person who came was the Qin Emperor, Xin Qifeng. He stood there and looked at the back of the figure. The smile on his face grew wider. He had been waiting for this battle for a long time. When he heard the news, he wanted to rush over immediately. However, he was busy and could not leave. After completing his task, the Qin Emperor immediately went to ask for permission. Then he rushed over impatiently. Now he saw Xiaoyang, the young man he wanted to fight. Moreover, the young man in front of him had an extraordinary meaning to the Qin Emperor. When he was at the peak of the Martial King realm, he could rely on the power of a world to kill a Martial King expert. It showed how terrifying and powerful he was. Now he had stepped into the Martial King realm and became the 10th Martial King expert in the 3,000 small worlds. To be able to do this, not to mention the future, he was an existence that no one had ever done before. How heaven-defying was such a talent! Only by fighting with such a young generation would he be able to display his true strength. Therefore, the battle that the Qin Emperor had been thinking about day and night could finally be realized. "Not fast. I'm not as fast as you," the Qin Emperor said excitedly. When the Qin Emperor left the drifting cloud world, he thought that Xiaoyang's words were just an unyielding attitude towards fate. However, who would have thought that he could really do it? All of this was enough to shock everyone. Such terrifying strength was really enviable. Hearing these words, Xiaoyang was also stunned for a moment. Soon after, he regained his senses and bitterly laughed. In the end, he had sacrificed too much to reach the Martial King realm. In fact, he had almost lost his life because of it. Fortunately, everything was daunting but not dangerous. He had survived until the end and reached where he was today. My speed is not fast. At least, among my peers in the 3,000 small worlds, I'm not the fastest, Xiaoyang said with a bitter smile. The Qin Emperor also smiled. At the same time, he was very proud. This was because, in his opinion, Princess Mingzhu was the undisputed #1 genius in the 3,000 small worlds. It could be said that the fate of the entire 3,000 small worlds would lean towards her. This was something that no one could be envious of, and she was his niece, so the Duke of Qin was very proud. Emperor Qin couldn't help but frown as he watched the young man push the world forward with determination. If Xiaoyang didn't let go, wouldn't their battle be in vain? Qin Wang wasn't willing to accept such an outcome. Therefore, he quickly began to think about what kind of method he should use to force this young man to make a move. Although this method was unavoidably risky. However, the willfulness you displayed was unparalleled in the world. Even among the 3,000 small worlds, you are a unique existence. Qin Wang chuckled. Tenacious and courageous. This was also the reason why the Duke of Qin admired this young man. Not to mention how he solved the situation in the Tomb of the Gods in one fell swoop and saved the realm of the gods a lot of trouble. The battle with Wei Beixin and Han Jingming that was enough to show how terrifying this person's ability and temperament were. Only by fighting with such a person could one be able to fight to one's heart's content. Senior, you flatter me. I'm not that powerful. It's just that I have a little bit of luck to be able to reach this stage. Xiaoyang smiled bitterly. Xiaoyang might not have believed it before, but at this point, the concept of fate couldn't be ignored. If Mu Yang hadn't found traces of the heart of the world, how could he have found it? Then, how could he have killed Su Changtian and borrowed the fate of the middle world to break through to the martial emperor realm? Hard work and luck could be said to complement each other. If you make even the slightest mistake, you may regret it for the rest of your life, and it will be difficult to change. Sometimes things were just that cruel. Regardless of whether you believed it or not, it was hard to go against it. Unless your own fate was so strong that it defied the heavens, you didn't need to borrow any external force. You're too humble. That's self-satisfaction. Qin Wang controlled his temper and said. Xiaoyang only smiled when he heard that. After all, this matter did have some meaning. However, as a junior, he naturally couldn't lack understanding. However, Xiaoyang didn't look forward to the battle with Qin Wang that much. That was because to him there was no conflict. Why should he fight? As the saying goes, no discord, no concord. However, at this critical juncture, if they were to start a war lightly, they would not be able to pull back when the time came. If they were to create an even more terrifying outcome, they would most likely be unable to bear the consequences and might even delay the important matter. Seeing that Xiaoyang did not have the slightest intention to fight, Qin Wang's expression immediately turned ugly. It was as if he did not have the slightest intention to fight. He didn't get a response, which made him very unhappy. Are you going to shirk away from the battle between us just like that? Qin Wang's expression suddenly changed as he asked. He came all the way here and even put aside many things. Qin Wang came all the way here just for this battle. If Xiaoyang didn't accept the battle, it could be said that he came in high spirits only to return in disappointment. Of course, to Qin Wang, he had to fight even if he didn't want to. If you don't fight, I have plenty of ways to force you to fight. After hearing that, Xiaoyang shook his head helplessly. He also understood the thinking of people like Qin Wang. They were like battle maniacs. If they met someone they thought was an opponent and couldn't fight, they would probably keep it in their hearts. For the sake of this battle, it was hard to say what kind of crazy methods would be used in the end. It was as if this battle was inevitable from the moment Xiaoyang stepped into the martial emperor realm. Qin Wang had already thought of him as an opponent. This wasn't something that could be avoided with just a few words. Everything was so realistic. I didn't say anything like that. It's just that the bigger picture is right in front of us. Can't we postpone our battle for a while? Xiaoyang said helplessly. Qin Wang shook his head without hesitation. His attitude was very clear. This battle couldn't be postponed. It could be said that it was imperative. In the blink of an eye, a few figures rushed over. Chapter 2146. They were Princess Mingzhu, unrivaled god Mu Yang, and the others. They rushed over as soon as they sensed Emperor Qin's aura. Princess Mingzhu came because She knew her fourth uncle's temperament. As for Unrivaled God and the others, they were just here to watch the show. This was because they had missed the battle between Xiao Yang and Princess Mingzhu, which was a huge regret. However, the battle between Xiao Yang and Emperor Qin was a battle between two martial emperors. They could not afford to miss it. After all, a battle between martial emperors was extremely beneficial to them. Perhaps if he could gain some enlightenment while watching the battle, he might gain even more from it. In such a situation, how could they miss out on this opportunity to improve their strength? Princess Mingzhu walked over quietly and stretched out her hands, ready to take over Xiao Yang's task. She said, "Don't worry, I won't delay your journey." Xiao Yang smiled helplessly when he heard that. Since Princess Mingzhu had cut off all his worries, this battle seemed to be unavoidable. Emperor Qin laughed out loud when he saw that. Now that he thought about it, he did not dote on his niece for nothing. She even knew to help him at such a crucial time. Unrivaled God looked on with great interest. After all, he was the kind of person who was not afraid of things getting out of hand. Moreover, they were just sparring. It was not a battle of life and death. Why should they worry so much? Sometimes worrying was completely pointless. Therefore, there was no need to worry about how things would go. On the other hand, Mu Yang and Ji Fei looked at each other. Their expressions were rather solemn. At the same time, countless thoughts flashed through their minds. In the end, they could only give up. This was because they did not have any right to speak in the face of such a situation. As such, there was no way to stop this battle from happening. There was nothing they could do other than watch from the sidelines. You don't have any excuses now, do you? Emperor Qin could no longer hold back his laughter. Hearing these words, Xiao Yang helplessly shook his head and said, "No." This was like forcing a duck onto a perch. Although Xiao Yang didn't really want to fight this battle, he was already pushed into it. Because he was suppressed by the great Tao of the 3,000 worlds, Xiao Yang had to restrain his strength. He had even suppressed his cultivation level to below the martial emperor realm, for fear of a counterattack. In this way, no matter how he fought, he wouldn't be able to fight to his heart's content. It could be said that his hands and feet were tied. However, when he saw Qin Wang's incomparably urgent expression, he had no choice but to agree. After Qin Wang received his reply, he laughed heartily. He was feeling extremely carefree. The battle that he had been thinking about day and night had finally arrived. Unrivaled God's eyes sparkled. He wanted to see just how intense the battle between the two would be. And would they be able to determine a victor? After Xiao Yang slowly retreated, he looked up and quickly began to search for the location of the battle. In a battle between martial emperors, every move could move mountains and overturn seas. Sometimes, even the unintentional aftermath of the battle could be an extremely terrifying disaster for other worlds. Immediately, Xiao Yang found a relatively empty space in a flash and immediately flew over. This place was at least tens of thousands of miles away from the surrounding worlds. No matter how terrifying the aftermath of their battle was, it wouldn't affect them at all. Of course, if there were any ignorant cultivators who insisted on joining in the fun, they could only blame themselves for the consequences. Mu Yang, Unrivaled God, and the others immediately followed. They had never seen how a battle between martial emperors would be fought. Now that there was such a great opportunity before them, how could they miss it? Therefore, they were looking forward to this battle very much. After standing still, Xiao Yang began to calm down. He also suppressed the realm in his body again, so that he wouldn't use his martial emperor's power if he didn't know how to control his strength. If that were to happen, Xiao Yang would probably have to face the heavenly punishment, thunder, tribulation again. The Duke of Qin, on the other hand, stood 3 miles away from Xiao Yang. His eyes were blazing like torches. Because he was standing still, his expression had undergone an earth-shattering change. Emperor Qin now looked like a ferocious tiger. His aura was fierce, and every breath he took was the movement of the Tao. At least to the 3,000 small worlds, the 9 martial emperors were the representatives of this world. Their every move was enough to trigger the power of heaven and earth. Back then, Han Jingming could no longer trigger the power of heaven and earth because he was rejected by the 3,000 small worlds. It was difficult for him to perform all the divine powers of a martial emperor. It was the same for Su Changtian. In a completely sealed and rejected space, he could only use his own power. Otherwise, it would not be easy for Xiao Yang to kill these two people. I have to admit that you are the most outstanding young man I have ever seen in my life. In fact, even I feel ashamed of my inferiority, Emperor Qin said word by word. Emperor Qin's realm could be said to have been achieved through his own fists. After he understood this young man, he already felt that he was a kindred spirit. Of course, he felt that Xiao Yang was much smarter than him, but that was it. Emperor Qin had once thought highly of Lei Dingtian. However, the world made fools of people. A monster like Xiao Yang had appeared. Otherwise, Lei Dingtian's glory would have been very bright. At least, if you can become the 10th martial emperor, it will be enough to make the entire god realm look up to you. Many of our ancestors have spent countless efforts, but they could not become the 10th martial emperor. Even Princess Mingzhu, the chosen one, could not do it. Emperor Qin said with admiration. This was also why the Duke of Qin admired Xiao Yang the most. Such a magnificent feat was also something he admired. At this point, Emperor Qin no longer saw him as a young man, whether it was ability or realm. This young man already had the qualifications to be on equal footing with them. When Xiao Yang heard these words, he only smiled in response. After all, everything he did was not for the recognition of others, but for himself. If he had some spare time, he would help the people around him and let them become stronger. That would be enough. Chapter 2147. Xiao Yang's way of thinking was simple and pure. At least for now, this was his way of thinking, and he would not change it. He did not expect that even the Qin emperor of the god realm would admire him, but his heart was still as calm as an ancient well. At least, from Xiao Yang's point of view, this was all within reason, and it could not be said to be heaven-defying. Or perhaps it was because their perspectives were different, so their views in this aspect were worlds apart. I've been thinking about this battle day and night for a long time, and it's finally here today. I hope that we can fight to our heart's content, and neither of us should act like a sissy and hold back. The Qin Emperor took a deep breath and said, in the Qin Emperor's sparring, there was no such thing as stopping after a certain point. Although it was not to the extent of sacrificing one's life, there was still a need to determine the victor and loser. If the sparring was just for fun, then how much benefit would it bring to one's cultivation? Only by giving one's all in every battle would one be able to understand where one's shortcomings were. When Xiao Yang heard these words that were almost crazy, the corner of his mouth could not help but twitch a little. The Qin Emperor was indeed, like what they said, a madman who loved to fight. Up until now, he did not have the demeanor of a senior at all. Of course, this made Xiao Yang feel very comfortable. They were now cultivators of the same realm. Their statuses were equal, and they had received the respect they deserved. Everything depended on one's strength and realm. Back when Xiao Yang had not stepped into the realm of martial emperor, the Qin Emperor had displayed his demeanor of a senior to the fullest. But up until now, there was no such demeanor. This was a subtle change. In fact, to the Qin Emperor himself, this was already something that could not be more normal. Then, as senior wishes, Xiao Yang took a deep breath and said, previously, Xiao Yang still felt a little lucky, and felt that this battle was just a test of the waters. But looking at the Qin Emperor's expression now, he did not have such thoughts. Since that was the case, Xiao Yang didn't have to worry anymore. Instead, he devoted himself to this battle. It wasn't bad to see the depth of his strength. Because Xiao Yang had calculated too much during his battle with Princess Mingzhu, it was hard for him to see where his limits were. But now that he was going to fight Qin Wang, he didn't have to worry so much anymore. He only needed to fight a simple battle, and that would be enough. The Duke of Qin nodded with a satisfied smile and said, "That's great." Since his opponent did not hesitate and did not think about other problems, this battle was bound to be a hearty one. And this kind of battle was exactly what he had been looking for. Unrivaled God's brows twitched involuntarily. Indeed, he had wanted to watch the show. But now this momentum was a little too big. "Fourth uncle, we have to prioritize the bigger picture," Unrivaled God persuaded Lin Huang softly despite his dilemma. After all, when these two almighties fought, who would push the drifting cloud realm when they were both seriously injured? If it was just Princess Mingzhu alone, it would still be a little difficult. If they delayed the journey, it would be delaying the most important thing in the heavenly realm. The Qin Emperor glared at Unrivaled God and scolded, "Brat, if you keep talking, I'll loosen your muscles and bones." Faced with such a threat, the corners of Unrivaled God's mouth twitched involuntarily. If the Qin Emperor loosened his muscles and bones, it would hurt his muscles and bones. It wouldn't be strange for him to be bedridden for years. "Fourth uncle, you're being a little unreasonable." Unrivaled God snorted coldly. If it were in the past, Unrivaled God would definitely admit defeat. However, Unrivaled God couldn't back down in this matter. "You talk too much." The Qin Emperor roared angrily and slapped out at the same time. It looked like a casual slap, but the power it contained was extremely terrifying. Anyone below the level of a martial emperor would be half dead even if they didn't die. Unrivaled God stood there without moving at all. Suddenly, the power in his body surged out continuously. Faced with the elder's scolding, he wasn't afraid at all. Even though he knew he was no match for the Qin Emperor, he had to give it a try. However, just as the slap was about to hit Unrivaled God, the space in front of him distorted, and the force of the slap disappeared without a trace. Unrivaled is just thinking about the big picture. "It doesn't seem right for you to treat him like this, senior," said Xiaoyang. Naturally, it was Xiaoyang who had attacked earlier. How could he just watch his friend get beaten up? The Qin Emperor was slightly surprised at first, but he immediately gave a thumbs up and said, "Good move." He turned a deaf ear to the conversation between them. Unrivaled God shook his head helplessly. He now understood that no matter what he said, it would be useless. Even the God Emperor couldn't stop this battle. How could he possibly do it? For a moment, Unrivaled God couldn't help but feel disheartened. At the end of the day, it seemed that he didn't have the right to speak because he wasn't powerful enough. If he were a martial emperor, would his fourth uncle still turn a deaf ear to his words? Xiaoyang smiled and said, "It's just a small trick." During this time, Xiaoyang had completely comprehended the first 2 scrolls of the teleportation skill. Moreover, he had reached the level where he could use it as he wished. The Qin Emperor smiled as well. To him, this was indeed a small trick. No matter how mysterious it was still a small trick. It couldn't change the outcome of the battle at all. In the face of absolute power, no matter how mysterious it would still be vulnerable. The corners of Muyang and Chu Taiyin's mouths twitched when they saw this. The way these almighties did things was really hard to fathom. It could be said that their actions were completely based on their desires. They didn't think too much about it at all. Soon after, the two of them looked at each other and quickly retreated. After all, the Qin Emperor didn't know how to control his strength. If they were caught in the crossfire, they might not even be able to keep their cultivation base. Unrivaled God and the others could only retreat when they saw this. They didn't dare to make a move. Reality was cruel sometimes. Even if you tried your best, it would be difficult to get an answer that satisfied you. Seeing that everyone had tactfully retreated, the Qin Emperor no longer had any qualms. He let out a low roar and charged toward the young man like a meteorite. Chapter 2148. Emperor Qin's move had already affected the might of the heavens and earth. Instantly, he seemed to have turned into a deity, imposing without being angry. Just as he raised his fist, a storm had already gathered. Countless amounts of energy quickly gathered, and the fist was even more majestic. The attack of a martial emperor was already so terrifying. Sometimes he could even affect the power of the heavens and earth unintentionally. This was the privilege of a martial emperor in the 3,000 small worlds. He was favored by countless people. With just a raise of his hand, he could affect the power of the heavens and earth. When Xiaoyang felt his opponent charging towards him, he instantly quivered. In the next moment, he immediately focused and raised his fist at the same time. Since Emperor Qin wanted to engage in close combat, Xiaoyang could not have asked for more. This was because in this battle, the only thing he could rely on was the strength of his physical body, his own strength. If he used his spiritual energy, he would be restrained. Once he stepped on the line, he would even attract divine punishment. Therefore, a battle like this was exactly what Xiaoyang wanted. As for Qin Wang's attack, it could be said that it was exactly what he wanted. However, as for the final result, it was not something he could think about now. How terrifying was his opponent's strength? His current perception could only give him a rough idea. As for how terrifying his opponent's strength was, it was still unknown. Therefore, Xiaoyang could only suppress his impatience and give it a try. It was hard to tell what the outcome would be. When Emperor Qin saw that Xiaoyang did not choose to use any divine ability or technique to counter his attack, and was instead prepared to fight him head-on, he immediately felt extremely carefree. Only a battle like this could be called comfortable. In the blink of an eye, the two fists had arrived. Instantly, when they collided, a huge force attacked each other. The sound of explosions could be said to be incessant for a while. The shock caused both parties to quickly retreat, not daring to continue fighting. Under this pure physical strength, although Emperor Qin's every move affected the power of the heavens and earth, he still could not withstand the attack of this huge force. He could only quickly retreat and pull back the huge force. The aftermath of the power continued to spread out like wind blades. Wherever they passed, the void would be sliced open. Unrivaled God, on the other hand, was dumbfounded as he watched. The duo's battle style was a little too ferocious, but at the very least it could be said to be very direct. It was rare to see such a fist-to-flesh battle. To be able to fight to such an extent was somewhat unexpected. However, since they had already fought to such an extent, it was already impossible for them to retreat now that they had attacked. Mu Yang subconsciously touched his waist, where his vermilion badge was hidden. It seemed that ever since he obtained this magic tool, he had never engaged in close combat again. Moreover, according to the explosion of power just now, if he were to let these two people get close to him, he might be beaten to death with a single punch. Valiant people were indeed hard to estimate. Just how terrifying was their strength? Qin Wang also laughed heartily because he felt that this exchange of blows was very comfortable. It could even be said that this feeling was very good. Good lad! The smile on Qin Wang's face grew wider. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, smiled faintly and waved his arm gently, dissipating the remaining power from earlier. At the same time, Xiaoyang already had a rough estimate of Qin Wang's strength. Qin Wang's physical strength was indeed valiant, far surpassing that of cultivators of the same level. It was probably because of this that the Qin emperor made such a choice. He wanted to use his advantage to defeat his opponent. However, Xiaoyang was even more extraordinary in terms of physical cultivation. Moreover, after the heavenly punishment thunder calamity, his physical body was the first to step into the level of a martial emperor. His physical body alone was enough to rival a martial emperor powerhouse. I'd like to see just how good you are at fighting, Qin Wang said as he began to wave his hands again. In the blink of an eye, the power began to surge rapidly as if it could not be stopped. The vigorous power was even more oppressive. In the God realm, the Emperor God sat high up on the main seat. Below him stood a man in a green robe. Second brother, you've worked hard on this trip, the Emperor God said with a smile. Today, King Zhao and King Da had completed their tasks and brought Sun Snow Realm to the border of the God realm. As for how to bring them to the border, this matter was handed over to King Zhao. King De, on the other hand, had rushed over to report as soon as possible. It's just for the God realm, it's not hard at all. Moreover, 3 martial emperors took turns to fight. It's still very easy, King De said with a smile. The Emperor God smiled and nodded. That was indeed the case. However, the journey was long, and it was still a test of one's patience. Moreover, to move the world, one had to avoid any mistakes. Hence, one had to be even more careful. This was also a huge test of one's temperament. I heard that 4th brother has already returned, but I can't see him. Could it be that he really ran to Drifting Cloud Realm? King De asked worriedly. The Emperor God nodded with a smile and said, We all know him. Even I can't stop him. When King De heard this, he couldn't help but frown. It wasn't that he couldn't stop King Qin. However, if he did, who knew what kind of trouble he would cause in the future? Fortunately, they were still in a period of preparation. Once he had caused enough trouble, he would naturally stop. Do you want me to make a trip? King De asked worriedly. The Emperor God was also silent, because in their hearts, they were very clear about their youngest brother. If this battle really started, there would be no such thing as stopping at a certain point. Perhaps there would be even more serious consequences. At that time, when both sides suffered, there might really be some situation. King De also had his concerns about this. That was why he suggested this idea. Even if they broke through the sky and he went, he would be able to help out. At that time, it wouldn't be too much of a delay. All this time, King De had been looking at the big picture. Since that's the case, I'll have to trouble 2nd brother to make this trip, the Emperor God said with a bitter smile. King De cupped his hands and bowed. He said, Big brother, you're exaggerating. This is just part of our job. Furthermore, I haven't seen Xiaoyang in a long time. It's not bad to visit an old friend. The Emperor God smiled and didn't say anything. As for King De's little thoughts, he could somewhat guess them. Chapter 2149. After a few rounds of fighting, Emperor Qin and Xiaoyang separated again. After a few punches, both of them were evenly matched. It was hard to tell who was better. It was as if the two of them were equally matched in terms of their attainments in this aspect. At that moment, it was even harder to tell who was better. On the other hand, Shen Wushuang and the rest were already dumbfounded. This was because they were now incomparably shocked. Both of them had been fighting with their fists since the beginning. Furthermore, there were no fancy moves. It could even be said that every punch hit the flesh. It was such a crazy battle, but both of them looked as if nothing had happened. This was even more shocking and incomprehensible. Could it be that both of them were monsters? Although both of them looked very relaxed and comfortable on the surface, that was not the case at all. This was because their arms had begun to tremble slightly in the midst of this battle. This was all caused by the recoil. Neither Emperor Qin nor Xiaoyang could avoid it. They could only silently endure the excruciating pain that was difficult to calm down. Sometimes, things were just so frustrating. No matter how one looked at it, it was not an easy task to determine the winner when they were evenly matched. Xiaoyang took a few deep breaths, forcibly suppressing the surging blood qi in his body. However, there were some changes in his expression now. On the other hand, Emperor Qin was still extremely shocked. He had heard that Xiaoyang had some attainments in physique tempering. However, he did not expect that he was already this powerful. It's hard to imagine that your physique cultivation attainments are much higher than Lei Dingtian's. Emperor Qin took a deep breath and smiled. Lei Dingtian was the pride of the Thousand Thunder Realm. Since the beginning of his cultivation, he had been using thunder and lightning to refine his body. Later on, even after he left the Thousand Thunder Realm, he still had the Silent Thunder Pearl and other magic treasures to support him. However, compared to Xiaoyang, there was still a huge gap. This was a characteristic of a world. The Thousand Thunder Realm's characteristic was the strength of one's body. However, the characteristics of the Flowing Cloud Realm were not like that. As for the environment of the flowing cloud world, apart from a few things that looked wondrous, it was difficult to put them into practice. The king of Qin was also somewhat uncertain about this point. Xiao Yang did not have any environmental advantages, but he was still able to reach this step today. Wasn't this a little too terrifying? What exactly did this guy go through to be able to achieve what he has today? In an instant, Qin Wang's thoughts began to expand rapidly. However, the final result was still difficult to understand. It's just that the Tao we cultivate is different, Xiaoyang said. Hearing this, King Qin was stunned for a moment before he regained his senses. It seemed that ever since the news of the Thousand Thunder Realms spread, Lei Dingtian's temperament had indeed been greatly affected. Lei Dingtian, who was one step ahead of Xiaoyang in the past, was now unable to catch up. How many years had it been? Such a huge change had already taken place. The affairs of the world were unpredictable. No one knew what would happen next. No matter how good one's imagination was, it would be difficult to fathom. For example, no one could have imagined that Xiaoyang would become the 10th martial emperor. The covenant that the god emperor had given him back then was more or less meant to spur him on. Perhaps if he was lucky, he would be able to do it. However, ever since Princess Mingzhu occupied that portion of fate, no one thought that he could do it. However, he did it. It's easy for you to say, Qin Wang said with a smile. In the blink of an eye, the king of Qin launched another attack. Fist force continuously appeared. The chi force was so strong that it had already condensed into a physical form. It looked like a blade. It was as if any kind of protective Dharma artifact would be broken by this level of fist force. Even the physical body would not be able to withstand such an attack. The sudden increase in power also showed the king of Qin's attitude. The previous few attacks could only be considered as a warm-up. Now he was starting to get serious. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang also felt the terror of this power. He quickly understood. He knew that the king of Qin's attack was no joke. He would have to pay a price for it. The king of Qin was warming up earlier. How could Xiaoyang not be doing the same? At the beginning of the battle, their display of strength was only the tip of the iceberg. Previously, they were competing to see whose physical strength was stronger. Now, they would be competing to see who had control over their strength. When he saw the appearance of the fist force, Xin Wushuang's expression became much more serious. He knew that the real show was about to begin. As the fist force was launched, more and more fist forces appeared. It was as if there was no end to them. There was no end to them. The power of heaven and earth. When the king of Qin launched this punch, he had already affected heaven and earth. With the support of heaven and earth power, the fist force was even more powerful. On the other hand, Xiaoyang was being suppressed by the power of the heavens and earth. Under such circumstances, the gap between the two of them became apparent. However, no matter what, Xiaoyang was someone who could achieve the level of a martial emperor with his physical body. Therefore, this was where his advantage lay. Similarly, he threw out a punch as well, and his fist energy surged. So what if he could not use heaven and earth power? In his body, there was already a small world of its own. If he could not use the Tao, then he would use his own Tao. When the fist forces collided, the sound of shattering could be heard continuously. The two of them had yet to meet, but the momentum was already so terrifying. Shen Wushuang, Muyang, and the others were even more dumbfounded. They haven't even deliberately used their spiritual power, and it's already so terrifying. What would happen if we were to use it? Unrivaled God could not help inhaling sharply as he spoke. Such a huge commotion was indeed something that they had not expected. This was just too terrifying. Things had developed in such a way that was beyond one's expectations. Ji Fei smiled bitterly and said, "They're almighties who stand at the pinnacle. They can destroy heaven and earth with just a wave of their hand. How can we understand that?" Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin smiled bitterly at the same time. They did not see any techniques. What they saw was just a contest of strength. Perhaps in the face of absolute power, all techniques seemed so pale and powerless. Therefore, it was difficult for them to understand. The sound of shattering continued to ring in their ears, making them feel as if their insides were being torn apart. Chapter 2150. Emperor Qin's expression turned increasingly solemn as he watched his fist force being destroyed. He did not expect Xiao Yang's mastery of fist techniques to be on par with his. He could not fathom how terrifying this young man's potential was. He had cultivated for thousands of years and spent a lot of effort. He had even sought guidance from countless great teachers before he could achieve what he had today. However, this young man was still able to do it. What kind of monster is he? At this moment, Emperor Qin began to have doubts. All this while they had always thought that Princess Mingzhu was unique in terms of luck and talent. However, compared to Xiaoyang, was that really the case? If Emperor Qin knew that Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu were going to fight, his doubts would be dispelled. Of course, Princess Mingzhu was indeed the one chosen by the 3,000 small worlds. However, Xiaoyang's foundation was something she could never hope to reach. Both of them had their own strengths. It was just a matter of how they made use of each other's strengths. As more and more of the fist force was destroyed, the distance between the two of them closed. They seemed to be telepathic as they punched at the same time. They channeled all their energy into their fists and prepared to push each other back. Boom! The power exploded, and the two of them hurriedly retreated under this rebounding force. Even though Qin Wang had retreated quickly enough, there were still quite a number of energy fists that landed on his body. Instantly, his face turned even redder. Although Xiaoyang was also hit by the fist force, he looked as if nothing had happened. He stood there unmoved. When Qin Wang saw the other party's expression, he knew in his heart that he had suffered a small loss in this confrontation. It could be said that it was precisely because of this that he realized that he couldn't continue like this. "It seems like I've underestimated you," Emperor Qin said in a deep voice as he took a deep breath. Although Emperor Qin felt that something was off, he could not put his finger on it. However, he knew that if this continued, he would be boiled like a frog in warm water. When that happened, it would be hard to tell how he lost. Xiaoyang smiled and nodded, agreeing with Qin Wang's words. After receiving such a reply, Qin Wang wasn't angry at all. Instead, he laughed heartily. Previously, the Duke of Qin still had some misgivings. He was afraid that if he used too much strength, he would beat Xiaoyang half to death. He might even accidentally kill him. That wouldn't be good. But now, it seemed that such thoughts were completely unnecessary. Xiaoyang was not a soft persimmon that could be easily crushed. Since the other party was strong enough, he could be unscrupulous. Only in this way could he fight to his heart's content. With this thought in mind, how could Qin Wang not feel excited? For a battle maniac, being able to go all out in a battle was the most satisfying. Unrivaled God, on the other hand, placed his hand on his forehead. He could already imagine what was going to happen next. It seemed like these two fellows were really going to compete with each other. Previously, it was just a small skirmish. Now, it was likely that they would be serious, and the final result would most likely be out of control. Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin's expressions became much more relaxed. At the same time, there was a hint of joy on their faces. This was because, in their eyes, if Xiao Gongzhu was strong enough, their status would be higher. According to their description, the people of the heavenly realm had always been arrogant to the point of being sick. When that happened, it was inevitable that they would look down on the drifting cloud realm. It was inevitable that there would be some unpleasant friction because of this. However, if Xiao Gongzhu's ability was strong enough, the people of the heavenly realm might have to weigh their own and Xiao Gongzhu's ability before they dared to make such a decision. They wouldn't directly send the drifting cloud realm into a dead end. As long as one's fist was strong enough, everything would make sense. In these 3,000 mini-worlds, it could be said that one's fist had always been the unchanging truth. After Qin Wang calmed down his emotions and aura, A sharp glint was reflected in his eyes. His entire state had undergone a tremendous change. At this moment, countless spiritual energies were constantly converging and surging. In his body, it was like a tidal wave, raging and crashing against the shore. The aura around Qin Wang's body had also undergone a tidal wave due to the change in his power. Right now, he was like the center of a storm. His every move would affect the spiritual power within a radius of 10,000 miles. When he felt this change, Xiaoyang couldn't help but furrow his eyebrows. He was very clear that this spiritual energy tidal wave was extremely disadvantageous for him. It could be said that the power of heaven and earth had all gone to Qin Wang's side. Xiaoyang couldn't use it at all. In fact, he would be suppressed even more severely. "Eat my fist!" Qin Wang roared angrily. He instantly leapt up and attacked Xiaoyang. Qin Wang's leap was like a ferocious tiger, unstoppable. In the blink of an eye, an illusory figure appeared around Qin Wang. It was the illusory figure of a white tiger. The white tiger opened its bloody mouth. Its fangs gleamed coldly, seeming to be sharper than the divine sword. It was invincible. The whistling sound was like a tiger's roar. It was deafening. Even unrivaled God and the others who were thousands of miles away could not help but feel immense pressure when they heard the tiger's roar. In particular, the aura was so oppressive that they almost couldn't breathe. "I didn't expect Fourth Uncle to even use the white tiger, demon god." Unrivaled God frowned and said softly. Looking at the white tiger that soared into the sky, Unrivaled God became even more nervous. Although Xiaoyang did have a slight advantage earlier, whether he could still withstand the next attack was another matter altogether. At the very least, Unrivaled God was very uncertain right now. The power of this move was also not to be underestimated. Rumor had it that this move was Qin Wang's ultimate move back then. However, that was the ultimate move before he became a martial emperor. At this point, its power would most likely be even more terrifying and unrivaled. As the one being targeted, Xiaoyang felt as if his surroundings were being restricted. It was as if the four fangs had completely locked him in place. There was no way for him to escape at all. He could only let the white tiger penetrate his body, and he couldn't move at all. Move like thunder. Xiaoyang roared angrily and charged. Chapter 2151. Xiaoyang's body was surrounded by lightning. Due to the increase in his cultivation level and the fusion of his spiritual meridians, the thickness of the lightning was even more terrifying. Even the Emperor of Qin could not help but feel a little frightened when he saw this. In fact, he found it hard to understand what was going on. Xiaoyang was not a cultivator of the Thousand Thunder Realm, but his cultivation and use of the power of lightning had already reached such a terrifying level. What made the Emperor of Qin even more surprised was that Xiaoyang's moving like lightning was originally a sword technique. Today, he was able to integrate it into his fist technique. This was a little too unbelievable. At the very least, the Emperor of Qin could not understand what was going on. Not everything could be figured out. The Emperor of Qin was also aware of this, so he did not think too much about it. After this move, they would naturally be able to determine who was stronger. When that time came, it would be obvious who was stronger and who was weaker. The white tiger continued to grow. In the blink of an eye, it was as big as a mountain. That level of might caused the crowd to tremble. Even from thousands of miles away, one could almost see the white tiger's shadow. A martial emperor's attack was already so terrifying. Soon, the two of them began to exchange blows. The moment the tiger's fangs landed, countless lightning bolts swam up like spiritual snakes. However, every strike of the lightning was also very domineering. The lightning bolts continuously struck the tiger's fangs. However, the tiger's fangs were like indestructible divine weapons. No matter how the domineering lightning bolts struck them, they did not budge at all. For tiger's fangs closed in at the same time, as if they were ready to bite Xiaoyang to death. However, Xiaoyang had already charged over. The white tiger was only increasing the momentum. The most ferocious attack was still in the hands of the Emperor of Qin. To a large extent, that illusory figure was just bluffing. Of course, this was the case for Xiaoyang. However, for other cultivators, the shadow of the white tiger would be a nightmare that would be difficult to shake off. Emperor Qin was slightly surprised as well. Soon after, the smile on his face grew even wider. As expected, this brat had seen through the facade and found the real thing. Good timing. Qin Wang let out a low roar, and his fist suddenly came down. Instantly, countless white fist auras poured down like the Milky Way from the nine heavens. That kind of momentum was so vast that it made people feel that it was inconceivable. Xiaoyang was by no means a pushover. In the face of such a ferocious attack, his expression did not change at all. The bolts of lightning seemed to have come alive as they charged out in a frenzy. The two forces collided and began a frenzied bombardment and mutual destruction. Crackling sounds rang out in his ears. Xiaoyang stabilized his body and did not deviate from his original position under the impact. He continued to attack and break through the fist aura. Boom! Both of their fists collided, and the sound of explosions rang out one after another. There were also countless strange sounds. In the blink of an eye, both of them were sent flying once again, unable to control themselves. Unrivaled God, Ji Fei, and the rest watched with twitching mouths. Their eyes were glazed over. This was because they were standing thousands of miles away, but the force they felt was irresistible. In that case, how terrifying would the center of the explosion be? Although they had seen it with their own eyes, they still found it hard to believe. In the end, they could only attribute this to a martial emperor powerhouse. It was beyond their imagination. Although both of them had been separated by the impact, their forces remained where they were. They continued to attack each other until the last bit of their strength was exhausted. After Emperor Qin stood still, he coughed violently a few times and spat out a mouthful of blood. He looked at his hand and saw that there were scorch marks. Pain radiated from every part of his body. This caused Emperor Qin's brows to knit together. In this clash, Qin Wang did not manage to gain the upper hand. Instead, he was injured. He looked at Xiaoyang again. Although his clothes were torn and there were some wounds on his body, they were only superficial. Even though there was a slight change in his expression, and even his hands were trembling, he was still as resolute as ever. He stood there as steady as Mount Tai. At this moment, Xiaoyang began to think quickly about what kind of method he needed to use to end this battle. Although Emperor Qin had not used his trump card, he knew very well that it would be disadvantageous to him if he continued to drag this out. Soon after, Xiaoyang took in a deep breath and stealthily raised his spirits. If he wanted to obtain victory, then the true intent manifestation art could be said to be his final trump card and reliance. Although Xiaoyang's aura did not change much, the feeling he gave off was different. Naturally, King Qin was aware of this as well. Therefore, he was even more shocked. He really could not understand what kind of monster Xiaoyang was. How could he do this? Moreover, in the previous battle, he was obviously at a disadvantage. This lad did not seem to show his strength, but he hid it so well. He had just stepped into the realm of martial emperor, but his strength was already so terrifying. What would happen to him in the future? Emperor Qin was even more shocked when he thought of this. However, he had stayed in the realm of martial emperor for thousands of years. He had already comprehended many things to the point of perfection. It was the same for his opponent. He did not seem like a fledgling who had just stepped into the realm of martial emperor. For a moment, the doubts in Emperor Qin's heart increased. Many thoughts kept surfacing in his mind. He really couldn't understand why things had turned out this way, or was this lad born with it? Therefore, after breaking through to the next realm, he needed a very short time to adapt. He was able to quickly understand some of the tricks of the realm. Was that why he could compete with him? In fact, he even had a slight advantage. The more he thought about it, the more shocked Emperor Qin was. More than that, he was in disbelief. How could this be? If Emperor Qin did not know Xiaoyang well, he would have thought that he was purely a person who cultivated his body. However, the information he knew in the past told him that this was not the case. He could take care of everything under the dual cultivation. Chapter 2152. When this thought appeared in Emperor Qin's mind, he became even more shocked. In fact, he even felt that this was unreal. How was this possible? If one had enough time, it was naturally possible. However, how many years had Xiaoyang had? Or was this the benefit of the heavenly punishment, lightning tribulation? When Emperor Qin thought of this, the pressure in his heart lessened significantly. In this case, there was a reasonable explanation. Although the heavenly punishment was terrifying, if one could withstand it, there was no need to doubt the benefits one would gain. In this case, many things became logical. I didn't expect you to bring me so many unexpected surprises, Emperor Qin said sincerely, and the smile on his face deepened. It was really rare to find such a powerful opponent. Moreover, it was a young lad from the younger generation. Xiaoyang only smiled and nodded, saying there might be more. Emperor Qin only smiled. He couldn't deny this. For Xiaoyang to be able to come this far, it was naturally not that simple. Everything else aside, if one didn't have some heaven-defying ability to withstand the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation, one would only end up as ashes. How could one still be standing here and fighting with him? Then I'll wait and see, Emperor Qin said happily. Xiaoyang smiled as well. At the same time, he began to plan quickly in his heart. How should he end the battle? This became the most important thing he needed to plan. His opponent could rely on the energy of heaven and earth to continuously replenish his energy. However, Xiaoyang could only be restrained and let his body recover slowly. The difference between them was too great. Therefore, a protracted battle was ultimately disadvantageous to him. I feel that the battle between you and me today was very strange. Some of your actions even seemed very deliberate. Why is that? Emperor Qin asked in a low voice. This was also where Emperor Qin's doubts lay. He couldn't figure it out. However, he couldn't figure out what exactly was wrong with it. What Emperor Qin wanted was to fight to his heart's content with his full strength. However, Xiaoyang seemed to be holding back. The Qin Emperor was already prepared to reveal all of his abilities. If Xiaoyang continued to hide his true strength, it would not be a pleasant experience for him. Xiaoyang could only laugh helplessly when he heard this. This was because he didn't know how to answer this question. At least, he couldn't tell Emperor Qin about this for now. No matter what, he could only tell the truth when he met the Emperor God. Then, he could plan what to do when the time came. If you beat me, I'll tell you, Xiaoyang said with a smile. When Emperor Qin heard this, he couldn't help but frown. This little fellow's words more or less contained a hint of provocation. Moreover, he seemed to be very confident in his own abilities. After hearing this, unrivaled heavenly punishment lightning. Wasn't such a statement a little too much? No matter what, the King of Qin was still a veteran martial emperor. More or less, they all had their own trump cards, and Xiaoyang's words seemed a little arrogant. Or could it be that he was the same as her, enjoying the show without fear? However, thinking about it carefully, this guy was indeed very arrogant at times. But you have to be clear about the situation. If you don't have the confidence to win, such arrogance will only bring trouble to yourself. At that moment, many thoughts flashed through unrivaled God's mind. He wanted to know what was going on as well. Even Ji Fei's expression became a little nervous. He had heard about the temperament of this Qin Wang from the God realm. Next, if he lost his mind because of these few words, then the consequences would be very terrifying. Many martial emperors had the demeanor of an elder and would not argue with the words of the younger generation. However, Qin Wang was different. Most of the time, he acted according to his own temperament. He would not think too much or have too many misgivings. Different people had different opinions, just like Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin. They thought that Xiaoyang must be confident to say such words. Initially, They were still worried that the drifting cloud realm would be bullied after the alliance meeting due to the overall weak strength. However, if Xiaoyang could defeat Qinhuang now, then such worries would naturally come to an end. Brother unrivaled, do you have a way to end this battle? Ji Fei asked after thinking for a long time. Unrivaled God chuckled helplessly and said, if I had a way, I wouldn't have been beaten up by my own uncle. Sometimes, even the Emperor God can't hold this lunatic back. That's good, he's still rational. He won't kill me. Ji Fei frowned slightly when he heard this. Then he sighed helplessly. As long as unrivaled God did not kill him, it would be enough. Are you provoking me? Qinhuang asked with a cold laugh. Hearing this, Xiaoyang yawned, appearing to be bored to death. His provocation was even more obvious. It was as if the look in his eyes was telling Qinhuang that he was provoking him and that he should come and kill him if he could. Good boy. Do you think I'll fall for your trick? Now, I really want to beat you up, but I haven't lost my rationality. I'm sure this isn't good news for you, Qinhuang said with a ferocious expression. Although it was easy for the Duke of Qin's blood to boil, he still had a bottom line. Although he knew that Xiaoyang was provoking him on purpose, he was happy to fall into this trap. Sometimes, anger could indeed make a person lose their rationality. However, at the same time, anger could also make a person's attack sharper and more powerful. Qinhuang had always been aware of this. It was also because of his excellent control over his anger and rationality that he had accomplished a feat that many people thought was impossible. It seems like you're serious. Qinhuang's voice turned gloomy when he saw that Xiaoyang's expression did not change much. Qinhuang could no longer remain calm after being underestimated like this. As long as he could fight to his heart's content, other grievances would not be considered grievances. Moreover, to Qinhuang, not being able to fight was the real grievance. In the blink of an eye, Qinhuang's limbs and bones began to emit beams of dazzling golden light. Immovable golden body. Chapter 2153. At this moment, countless rays of golden light flowed out continuously. However, these rays of golden light did not spread outwards. Instead, they began to adhere to the surface of Qin Emperor's body. Under the dazzling golden light, it was difficult to see what was going on inside and what kind of state Qin Emperor was in. However, Xiaoyang could feel that his opponent's aura and strength were constantly rising. This made Xiaoyang feel shocked. He knew that Qin Emperor was indeed angry and was prepared to use his trump card to deal with him. Therefore, this battle was no longer as simple as a simple exchange of pointers. Between the two of them, there was bound to be a winner. It might even be a life and death battle. Under the influence of the two of them, this battle had evolved into an uncontrollable situation. Their minds were playing tricks, which was why such a situation had occurred. The overall situation was already set. This was something that no one could change. Unless there was an Almighty who could suppress both of them at the same time with his own strength, this battle could only end. Otherwise, it would only add fuel to the fire and make this battle even more intense. In the blink of an eye, Qin Emperor's body was covered in golden light. He looked like a golden man and was not much different from a god. After seeing this scene, Xiaoyang couldn't help but take in a breath of cold air. He had already experienced these techniques in the God realm. Back when he was fighting with Shen Hao, he had used one of these techniques. At the same time, his cultivation had also increased by a lot. However, that was only Shen Hao. Qin Emperor was a martial emperor. The increase in his cultivation could not be underestimated. Furthermore, in the martial emperor realm, even a small increase in strength could create an unimaginable gap between them. In this way, it could be said that one was decreasing while the other was increasing. Because of this, Xiaoyang's situation would become worse. If he could unleash all the abilities of a martial emperor, Xiaoyang would naturally not be afraid. However, he still maintained his rationality. He could only continue to suppress his own realm. He did not dare to use too much of his spiritual power, lest he incurred the wrath of the heavens. Under such a restrained battle, Xiaoyang's heart could be said to be extremely sullen, but at the same time he was also helpless. He also wanted to fight to his heart's content, but there was no other way. Therefore, if he wanted to win, he had to think more and see if he could find his opponent's weakness. Otherwise, the consequences would be extremely terrifying. Xiaoyang, if you don't use your full strength, what do you think the outcome will be? The Qin Emperor's lips curled up as he spoke, as though he was extremely pleased with himself. In the face of such a situation, Xiaoyang felt extremely uncomfortable in his heart. At this point, even if he wanted to refute, it seemed to be useless. It couldn't be helped. After all, as a variant, he was suppressed by the grand Daos of the 3,000 minor worlds. Sometimes, if you want to take some benefits and get something, then you have to pay a corresponding price. However, the price Xiaoyang had to pay was a little too heavy. Therefore, he could not act recklessly anymore. Although Xiaoyang had survived the wrath of the heavens, his body was severely damaged, and his vitality was almost completely cut off. If it wasn't for the heart of the world keeping him alive and breaking through to the martial emperor realm, he would have been dead by then. Therefore, under such a situation, how should he make a choice? This gave Xiaoyang a headache. Weren't your words of mockery very good earlier? Why have you become mute now? The Qin Emperor also began to mock him. It could be said that he did not hold back at all. One must enjoy life to the fullest. Xiaoyang was not an indecisive person. He immediately made up his mind. Indeed, he could not use the power of King Wu's realm. Otherwise, the consequences would be even more severe. However, he still had to fight. He could only rely on his martial emperor realm physical skills to defeat his opponent. That breath of spirit made Xiaoyang even more high-spirited. It was as if all the difficulties and dangers were insignificant in front of this breath of spirit. After seeing this scene, Qin Wang's eyes flashed with a trace of surprise. Even now, this fellow is still showing such a high-spirited appearance. What is he planning in his heart? Sometimes the conflicts between them were also due to a battle of wills. The strength of one's state of mind was indeed related to the situation of a person's battle. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang had already calmed down. At the same time, he was prepared to fight to the bitter end. As if it was because of this strange state, Xiaoyang's body also emitted rays of mysterious light. It seemed to be resonating with the golden light. After seeing this, the smile on Qin Wang's face grew even wider. This was what he wanted to see. Xiaoyang was indeed capable. Otherwise, why would he be in such a state? If a person could be arrogant, they would need to have the right to do so. It seemed that arrogance with the right to do so was not considered arrogance. Now, the Qin Emperor was looking forward to it. He felt that this young man would bring him more unexpected surprises. Who knows? He might even benefit from this battle. It was hard to say. Shen Wushuang, Ji Fei, and the others were watching with their mouths agape. They were even more shocked by the techniques displayed by these two almighties. A battle between martial emperors was indeed extraordinary. Most of the time, it could be said that they had used up all their tricks. In fact, the ingenious techniques they displayed were even more numerous. These two are really like gods fighting. Other things aside, I don't know how long it'll take us to learn such techniques, Shen Wushuang teased. Ji Fei understood what he meant and said, "If you don't reach that level, you won't be able to learn it even if you learn it for a lifetime." With that, the two of them looked at each other and smiled. At this moment, Xiaoyang had also steadied his state of mind. At the same time, he began to quickly mobilize his strength. Fist force after fist force emerged continuously. His own strength was like an angry beast that had been imprisoned for a long time. It was about to be released and was ready to unleash all the resentment that had been accumulated for countless years. After the Qin Emperor sensed this, a scornful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. However, in the next moment his expression became extremely solemn. In the battle between them, a moment of carelessness could lead to his defeat. Chapter 2154. At this moment, Emperor Qin had adjusted himself to a state that he was most satisfied with. 70% anger and 30% rationality. This was Emperor Qin's best state. It was also one of his secret techniques for winning every battle. For him to deal with Xiaoyang in such a way, it could be said that he was giving him full respect. In other words, among the 3,000 small realms who could reach the martial emperor realm, which one of them was a simple person, not to mention their talent, just their pitiful amount of luck was enough to make people fight to the death. If they weren't the best, they wouldn't be able to do it. Qin Wang stretched his body a little. Although he looked a little stiff, his every movement gave people a very shocking feeling. It was as if one punch from him could destroy the heavens and earth. Just now, Qin Wang seemed to have casually raised his hand. Soon after, he threw 2 punches toward Xiaoyang. The 2 punches were extremely overbearing. They were headed straight for Xiaoyang. Xiaoyang snorted coldly when he saw the 2 fist forces rushing towards him. He quickly threw out a punch and shattered the 2 fist forces. Qin Wang's face was also filled with shock. He did not expect that the brat would be able to easily break through his 2 punches with the support of the immovable golden body. This meant that the brat's physical body was also extremely terrifying. All of a sudden, the Qin Emperor thought of another possibility, which was that Xiaoyang also had a method, which was why he was able to fight against him. If that was the case, he knew what was going on. If that was the case, it seemed like they were on par with each other. Plunder like fire! Now that the situation had changed, Emperor Qin's abilities were at their peak. Plus, Xiaoyang knew that he couldn't fight a battle of attrition. He had to end the battle quickly. Therefore, he had to rush forward and find an opportunity to end the battle. The longer the battle dragged on, the more disadvantageous it would be for Xiaoyang. He knew what was more important and what was more important. He had to change the situation. If he didn't, he would be the one to suffer. Kid, it seems like you're in a hurry. If that's the case, then I'm going to win. As Qin Wang spoke, he revealed a satisfied smile. Such a move was very different from Xiaoyang's previous stance. Previously, it had always been the Duke of Qin who made the first move. But now, Xiaoyang had begun to seize the initiative. This was a problem to begin with. At the very least, this was somewhat different from a person's style. What exactly is Xiaoyang worried about? Unrivaled God asked, puzzled. Unrivaled God had seen it before. Xiaoyang had always planned before acting. He would never act recklessly. But now he seemed to have lost his sense of propriety and attacked. This was indeed a little puzzling. Looking at it now, it was indeed very abnormal. Maybe clan leader Xiao wants to delay for too long and is afraid of delaying the important matters. So he wants to end the battle quickly. Ji Fei's expression became a lot more dignified as he spoke his guess. However, he wasn't sure if this was the case. However, this seemed to be the only reasonable explanation. Mu Yang shook his head and said, I think he seems to be suppressed by something. That's why he has to end the battle quickly to avoid any problems later. Unrivaled God and Ji Fei both turned to look. Both of them could not help but frown. Between heaven and earth, what kind of suppression could Xiaoyang be under? Or rather, who in the 3,000 mini-worlds could suppress Xiaoyang? However, they did not have an answer in their hearts. Since ancient times, the 9 great martial emperors had been relatively equal in status. This was because the gap between them was not that great, and it was difficult for anyone to suppress the other. Even the battle-hungry and powerful Qin Wang had only been able to suppress Han Jingming with the help of King Zhao when he went on a crusade against the Greenly world. Question after question filled their hearts with more and more questions. They could not find any answers. At this moment, Xiaoyang was like a meteorite as he charged towards the top. Countless flames covered Xiaoyang's body. It was like a coat that could withstand many attacks. Qin Wang still stood there without moving. It was as if he was facing such a terrifying attack, but he was still as calm and composed as ever. No matter how aggressive you were, you would not be able to shake my position. Suppressing spell! Qin Wang roared. He immediately formed a hand seal with both hands. The next moment he pressed down. Instantly, countless golden rays poured out. In a short period of time, each ray of golden light turned into a seal that was stable and flat. Each seal gave people an incomparably heavy feeling. It was as if a mountain range was crashing down without stopping. Perhaps it was because the power was too terrifying, countless explosions rang out continuously. It was because the space could not withstand such a huge force and was constantly shattering. As he listened to the crisp sounds, the pressure Xiaoyang felt grew stronger and stronger. Just by appearing, it already had such power. If it really landed on his body, how terrifying would the power displayed be? This was something that was hard to imagine. At the very least, Xiaoyang couldn't be sure of it. However, being unsure was another matter. It was not enough to make him retreat. On the contrary, the momentum of his charge became even more violent. If he wanted to win, he could only charge forward and use his own strength to resist. If he started to be afraid, the situation he was facing would become even worse. When two rivals meet on a narrow path, the courageous would emerge victorious. As long as he had enough courage, he might be able to create a miracle. If he was timid, he would definitely lose. As the first seal fell, Xiaoyang directly slammed his head into it. Everyone's gaze was focused there. Everyone was extremely nervous. In this confrontation, it was as if the outcome of the battle was about to be decided. However, as for the final outcome, it was still very exciting. Boom! The first seal was shattered into pieces by Xiaoyang's attack. So what if you are a mountain of gold? Under Xiaoyang's violent impact, the erosion of the huge force was naturally difficult to resist. Following that, countless seals fell one after another and began to shatter at the same time. The young man charged forward. His head was incomparably iron. He shattered one golden mountain after another without any fear. Chapter 2155. When the Qin Emperor saw Xiaoyang break through his pacification spell like a hot knife through butter, his unstoppable aura surging towards him made him even more shocked. Could it be that this guy was really crazy? Or is it that his body is even more terrifying than my immovable golden body after being strengthened by a secret technique? Is that why he can ignore all the damage from the calming spell? Then the Emperor of Qin calmed himself down. He knew very well that it was impossible for Xiaoyang to break through his spell without suffering any damage. Otherwise, his calming spell would no longer be one of his ultimate techniques. It could only be said that Xiaoyang's abilities were indeed terrifying. His mentality was also like a young man's, charging forward bravely. So what if there was a wall of copper and iron in front of him? As long as he was hot-blooded, he could use his head to smash it open. It could be said that being young and hot-blooded was the privilege of young people. Because they had little experience and were hot-blooded, they were able to do such a crazy thing. The Emperor of Qin did not pity them because of this. Instead, he increased the strength of his calming spell. He knew very well that if he hesitated, he would be the one to lose in the end. However, he did not want to lose. Being defeated at the hands of a youngster, if word of this got out, he would probably be ridiculed by others. That was fine. At least in the Emperor of Qin's heart, he could not accept this reality. Therefore, he had to win. After smashing through countless golden bricks, Xiaoyang was only 3 feet away from the Emperor of Qin. Suddenly, his speed increased. The golden mountain in front of him was also instantly smashed into pieces, but his head was already bleeding profusely. When Xiaoyang appeared in front of him, a trace of fear appeared in the Emperor of Qin's eyes. This was indeed out of his expectations. Xiaoyang actually still had some strength left. Is this guy really a monster? His control over his power was indeed a little strange. At least, the Emperor of Qin found it hard to understand. This punch landed directly on the Emperor of Qin's chest. Instantly, a muffled sound shook the sky like the beating of a drum. The Emperor of Qin's golden body seemed indestructible. However, his entire body was still shaken to the point of moving back a few steps. In the next moment, the battle-savvy Qin Huang also threw out a punch, preparing to force Xiaoyang back. However, after he punched out, Xiaoyang didn't retreat at all. He punched him in the chest again. Instantly, both of them were pushed back by the other's power, unable to control themselves. Unrivaled God and the rest watched with their mouths agape. It was indeed rare to see such a life-for-life tactic. At the very least, such a situation rarely occurred in a spar between acquaintances. But now it had appeared. There was no deep hatred between the king of Qin and Xiaoyang, so why was he acting like this? Ji, Fei, and Unrivaled God looked at each other. They did not understand why the battle had turned out this way. After Qin Huang steadied himself, he couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. This was because he could feel a burning pain coming from his chest. Who would have thought that Xiaoyang's fist energy would actually break through his immovable golden body and even injure him? At this moment, the king of Qin's expression became more and more serious. It could be said that it was unexpected that he was injured. Feeling the burning pain coming from his chest, the king of Qin's expression was completely unbearable at this moment. Looking at Xiaoyang again, although his head was broken and bleeding, and could be said to be in an extremely sorry state, his spirit did not lose the slightest bit. It could even be seen that he was secretly holding back his anger and was prepared to continue fighting. The king of Qin laughed bitterly in his heart. Was he really getting old? Was he no longer comparable to these young people? The more he thought about it, the more upset the king of Qin felt. Xiaoyang looked up at the king of Qin, who looked like he was made of gold. Then he let out a low roar and charged forward again. Xiaoyang's attitude was very clear now. He was going to strike while the iron was hot and not let the king of Qin off the hook. Since you've already shown a flaw, I must seize it and defeat you. Fist breaking 1,000 refinements. With this punch, countless streaks of drive started to converge at this moment. However, this was not because he was exhausted. Instead, he was planning an even more powerful attack. It might even decide the outcome of the battle. In Xiaoyang's opinion, with this move, the outcome of the battle would definitely be decided. Due to the restrictions, this was the most powerful martial technique that he could use now. Victory or defeat would be determined by this punch. This was a punch that could cut off all means of retreat. Although Xiaoyang still had a trump card, he felt that there was no need to use it against the king of Qin. When the king of Qin saw this young and aggressive fellow charging at him again, he was instantly shocked. In the next moment, he was unable to restrain his anger. This fellow was obviously taking advantage of his face. If he did not take out his trump card, his opponent would not let this matter rest. Since you want to decide the outcome of the battle, I'll do as you wish. Art of suppression. The king of Qin roared. He clasped his hands together and brought them down at the same time. Instantly, countless golden spears appeared at this moment. It was as if thousands of arrows had been shot at the same time. They covered the sky and covered the earth, densely packed. Facing the countless golden halberds, Xiaoyang continued to charge forward with a fearless expression on his face, relying solely on his willpower. In the blink of an eye, he had arrived. He allowed the golden spears to dazzle his eyes. However, he continued to charge forward with unparalleled precision. So what if his eyes could not see? However, he could still lock onto his opponent based on his aura. Countless golden spears fell, continuously hitting Xiaoyang's body. Some even penetrated his body. Xiaoyang did not seem to feel pain. He allowed the golden spears to baptize him without any reaction. Lunatic! The king of Qin could not help but roar. However, he could not change the outcome. This was because just as he finished speaking, Xiaoyang had already arrived in front of him. His fist came crashing down. It looked so slow, but there was nothing the king of Qin could do to stop it. This fist landed squarely on the king of Qin's chest. Instantly, his entire body fell like a meteorite. As he fell, the king of Qin spat out a mouthful of blood. This was because countless fist intent had appeared on his body and was wildly attacking him. Even his golden body began to shatter inch by inch under the countless fist intent. He could not maintain it any longer. The fist intent was like a torrential rain, swift and dense. Chapter 2156. After a short moment, Qin Wang's figure could no longer be seen. It was unknown where he had been blasted to by the numerous fist intents. Xiao Yang hovered in the starry sky, watching the thunderclouds slowly gather. He could not help but sigh subconsciously. He did not expect the heavenly Tao suppression to arrive so soon after he had used some of his martial emperor's power. Xiao Yang immediately sealed his aura, suppressing his level to King Wu's peak. He did not leak any more of his aura. Qin Wang was indeed the best at fighting in the God realm. His ability was not to be underestimated. Xiao Yang had initially estimated that he would not need to use any more power to end the battle. However, it had still exceeded his expectations. Unrivaled God. Ji Fei and the others looked at each other. They had not expected the battle to end like this. Isn't this guy a little too strong? How did he do that? Unrivaled, God mumbled, stuttering. His tone was full of disbelief. It was simply unimaginable to him. Although his fourth uncle, Qin Wang, was not the strongest in the God realm, his combat skills were definitely the best. However, he had been defeated by Xiao Yang's ferocious attack. Just like that, unrivaled God could not believe what he had just witnessed. It was like a dream. It was not real at all. Ji Fei nodded stiffly and said, "That seems to be the case. Although it's theoretically impossible, it's not possible. However, this guy is sometimes able to grasp that tiny bit of opportunity and constantly expand it." Ji Fei recalled his time in the tomb of the god of sin. His god's soul had been sealed in ice, which was why he had retained a trace of purity. It was also because of this that Xiao Yang had seized this point and pulled him out of the abyss of eternal damnation. Sometimes this person's perspective was indeed different from ordinary people. Moreover, what he had done was even more shocking. It was as if miracles were nothing out of the ordinary to him. He could create them in a short period of time. Now, they could not help but recall some of the words they had said in the past. Suddenly, they could not remain calm. Those battle records were probably real. There was no bragging or luck to speak of. Otherwise, how could he have done what he had done in the battle with Qin Wang? He had even beaten his opponent to the point where they did not know if he was dead or alive. Mu Yang, Chu Taiyin, and the others' expressions became very serious. They knew that Xiao Yang was powerful, but they did not know that he was so powerful. At this moment, they knew that the drifting cloud realm status would be elevated because of Xiao Yang. After all, even one of the three kings of the God realm. In many things, even if the drifting cloud realm was wrong, the God realm would have to consider carefully before making a decision. They could not just do it casually. On the other hand, Xiao Yang did not have any expression of joy. Instead, he raised his head and looked at the tribulation clouds in the sky that were dispersing. He could not help but secretly sigh in relief. Fortunately, he had suppressed and concealed his strength in time, causing the tribulation lightning to lose its target. Otherwise, he would not have a good ending. Moreover, the place he was floating in was not the territory of the drifting cloud realm. He did not dare to be careless. Although the heavens were merciless, there were still some flaws. As long as you could make good use of the rules, even if you became an outlier, you could still avoid many things. However, with Xiao Yang's current situation, it was already impossible for him to advance to the next realm in the 3,000 small worlds. It was also because of this reason that Xiao Yang had to go to the middle world. As long as he went to the middle world, he would no longer be suppressed by the heavens. The next moment, endless pain assaulted him. Xiao Yang could not help but grit his teeth. Putting aside the fact that he had been battered and bruised by the Golden Mountains earlier, The countless golden spears that had pierced through his body earlier had already caused him great damage. It would take at least a month for him to fully recover from an injury like that. Xiaoyang was not worried about the Emperor of Qin's life at all. After all, he did not kill him. Moreover, the Emperor of Qin was no pushover. He could return as soon as he adjusted his condition. Then, Xiaoyang turned around and returned to the drifting cloud realm. Shen Wushuang and Ji Fei looked at each other, speechless. They did not say a word. Was the battle over just like that? Wasn't this a little too fast? Moreover, wasn't it a little too hasty and inappropriate to end the battle like that? However, Xiaoyang had already disappeared without a trace. It was impossible for him to ask the first half of the question now. Brother Wushuang, should we go look for the Emperor of Qin? Mu Yang asked guiltily after a long while. However, Mu Yang's heart was bursting with joy. Shen Wushuang glared at Mu Yang when he heard that. He could not help but feel a little angry as he looked at this old fart. How could he not understand what this old fart was trying to say? This was a blatant challenge to the God realm. However, as the loser, there was nothing he could do. Reality was like this. Even if one's teeth were broken, one could only swallow it. Sure, Shen Wushuang agreed after some thought. Shen Wushuang's lips curled into a smile after he finished speaking. Now that the Emperor of Qin had been defeated, he must be in a terrible mood. If he were to add fuel to the fire, he would probably be beaten up badly. Apart from Xiaoyang, who else here could beat him? Mu Yang felt a little awkward when he heard that, but he could not put his finger on it at the moment. I still have some matters to attend to. You guys can take your time discussing it. I'm leaving. Ji Fei suddenly coughed and stammered before leaving immediately. Chu Taiyin and the others also felt that the atmosphere was a little strange. They immediately turned around and left, not daring to hesitate at all. Shen Wushuang, on the other hand, snorted disdainfully. He felt that if these people dared to say such things but did not dare to face the consequences, what kind of heroes were they? Chapter 2157. In the boundless starry sky, a woman in snow-white robes pushed the entire world forward without a single complaint. Behind the woman was a man who was speaking non-stop. He appeared to be a bit noisy. If not for the fact that the woman really wanted to know what the battle was like, she would have slapped this guy out of the flowing cloud realm. As the saying went, out of sight, out of mind. Princess Mingzhu was extremely intelligent. She knew from Unrivaled God's description that there was no lack of embellishment. As a bona fide martial emperor, she naturally knew what the battle was like. As for the many places that Unrivaled God described so beautifully, it was merely his imagination. Princess Mingzhu's expression remained the same when she heard that the Emperor of Qin had been defeated. There was no change in her expression at all. Unrivaled God studied Princess Mingzhu's expression carefully when he saw this. However, he could not find anything wrong with her. Don't you think it's strange that fourth uncle was defeated this time? Isn't this a miracle? In other words, fourth uncle purposely went easy on him. Unrivaled God asked a series of questions as well. Princess Mingzhu was just too calm right now, which confused Unrivaled God a little. What was the reason for that? This reaction did not make sense. Immediately, Princess Mingzhu turned her head around and said, "Why? Do I have to be surprised with you to be considered normal?" Unrivaled God felt rather aggrieved when he was asked this question. He really didn't know how to respond to such words. Moreover, you and I both know fourth uncle's character. Do we need to doubt his abilities when he fights? Princess Mingzhu asked again. Unrivaled God was speechless when he was asked again. This was because he knew very well what kind of person the Emperor of Qin was. Even if he was sparring with a junior, the Emperor of Qin would not show any mercy as long as he agreed to it. It had always been like this. Therefore, the Emperor of Qin's defeat was not caused by him going easy on him. However, Unrivaled God still did not feel good about it. This was because he did not get the answer he was looking for. Even I lost to him. even if fourth uncle lost. What's so strange about that? Princess Mingzhu bitterly laughed and said, back then, although Princess Mingzhu's sword had the upper hand and she seemed to have one, she had no choice. However, she later understood that she had suffered a crushing defeat. The reason for this was very simple, and it was the same in every aspect. Because Xiao Yang's fist did not land, that was where benevolence and righteousness lay. If it were to land, her head would most likely explode. At that time, there might be even more trouble because of that punch. It was even possible for the Flowing Cloud Realm and the God Realm to become enemies. Therefore, the punch did not land on her head. However, Princess Mingzhu's heart suffered a heavy blow, and the pride that he had brought over all these years had also been smashed into smithereens because of that punch that had yet to land. Unrivaled God was completely stunned when he heard that. Although that battle had ended a long time ago, and he felt that it was very likely that it was a draw. But now, Princess Mingzhu had calmly admitted that she had lost. From this, it could be seen that the battle back then wasn't as intense as it had been back then. What exactly had happened in that battle when no one was watching? Now, Unrivaled God had more and more doubts in his heart. At the same time, he was indeed unsure. That young man from back then, in just a few short decades, had actually improved so quickly? Moreover, this was indeed a little inconceivable. All this time, Unrivaled God had thought that his cultivation progress was not bad. But by the looks of it now, compared to Xiaoyang, he was nothing at all. Xiaoyang returned to his little house to rest as usual, lying on that very familiar rattan chair. He had already taken several pills. All he needed to do was wait for the medicinal effects to spread and slowly repair his body. That would be enough. Meanwhile, Xiao Meng waited patiently by his side, fanning him with a round fan to cool him down. Right now, Xiao Yang's body was in a mess. Fortunately, the medicinal effects of these pills were indeed extraordinary. In a short period of time, his injuries were stabilized. However, it was still a little difficult for him to exert his strength. Not long after, a mysterious light flashed, and a man covered in blood appeared on the stone bench next to Xiaoyang. The newcomer's hair was disheveled, and his body was covered in wounds. It was a horrible sight. Xiao Meng could not help but jump in fright when she saw him. When she took a closer look, she realized that it was Senior Emperor Qin. She was even more shocked. "What are you looking at? Are you used to seeing my handsome face? Don't you recognize me now that I'm in such a sorry state?" Emperor Qin said, a little displeased. Xiao Meng covered her mouth and laughed when she recognized Emperor Qin. It was indeed her first time seeing the handsome Emperor Qin reduced to such a state. Emperor Qin felt a little uncomfortable when he saw Xiao Meng laughing like that. "Little girl, let me give you a piece of advice. Don't follow Xiaoyang anymore. This guy doesn't know how to control his strength. Maybe he'll hit you when he's in a bad mood," Emperor Qin teased. Xiao Meng did not take Emperor Qin's attempt to sow discord to heart. Instead, she said teasingly, "Do I have to follow your highness?" When Qin Wang heard this, he immediately nodded his head in satisfaction. His eyes were filled with the look of a child who could be taught. "But if that's the case, it'll be uncomfortable to be beaten by your highness every day," Xiao Meng said teasingly. Emperor Qin almost spat out a mouthful of blood when he heard that. This eccentric and quick-witted lass really dared to say such things. She only dared to say that because Emperor Qin's attitude towards Xiao Meng had always been good, and he had never shown any signs of authority. Emperor Qin was also worried. It was just some unintentional words, and they did not mean any harm. However, when he thought about how he was beaten by Xiaoyang, and how even his maidservant wanted to choke him with words, he felt terrible. Was there any justice in this world? Xiao Meng smiled even more happily when she saw Emperor Qin's terrible expression. This Emperor Qin had made fun of her many times back then. "Your Highness, let me give you a piece of advice. If you can't beat him in the future, you'd better run away. Otherwise, if you end up in such a sorry state, It'll be detrimental to your imposing demeanor. Xiao Meng continued to tease him. Chapter 2158. Right now, the Qin Emperor's face had turned the color of a pig's liver from anger. His heart was also extremely uncomfortable. Soon after, he turned his back and no longer looked. Xiaoyang, you should properly discipline this servant of yours. Every day, she doesn't have a proper appearance. Now, she even dares to make fun of me. What will happen in the future? The Qin Emperor said in an extremely displeased manner. When Xiaoyang heard this, he only shrugged and said, Qin Emperor, I heard it clearly even from here. With your ability to sow discord, I'm afraid that once you enter the palace, even the entire harem of the God Emperor won't be a match for you. Immediately, the Qin Emperor's expression became even worse. This fellow actually didn't give him any face at all, and even continued to add insult to injury. You master and servant pair are really too much. Even if I can't afford to offend you, can't I just avoid you? As the Qin Emperor spoke, he immediately stood up and walked towards a room without looking back. However, Xiao Man seemed to be unwilling to let the Qin Emperor off. She shouted, Your Highness, you must be careful when you walk. Otherwise, if you fall, you might break a few more teeth. That would really ruin your face. No matter how good the Qin Emperor's temper was, after hearing these words, he also began to curse. He felt that his decision to come to the Flowing Cloud Realm was completely wrong. After the Qin Emperor left, the small courtyard regained its tranquility. Only the swaying of the wrought tin chair and the fluttering of the round fan could be heard. The news of the battle between Xiao Gongzhu and the Qin Emperor could be said to spread like wildfire in the Flowing Cloud Realm. Immediately, the entire Flowing Cloud Realm could be said to be elated. This also became something that many people were incomparably proud of. The God Realm was the leader of the 3,000 small realms. But so what? Even the Qin Emperor, who was the most skilled in battle, lost to Xiao Gongzhu. Then, who else could be a match for him? Perhaps only the unfathomable God Emperor, who had never fought before, had the ability to fight against him. Such thoughts and words caused the Flowing Cloud Realm to become lively again. It also caused the spectating Muyang and Chu Tain to be extremely vexed. There were always juniors coming to ask about it. As for the Flowing Cloud Realm's progress, because of that battle it was delayed, because Princess Mingzhu's strength was still limited in the end. As a result, the Flowing Cloud Realm also began to move and stop. It wasn't that Xiaoyang didn't want to help. It was just that his injuries were quite serious, and it was difficult for him to do so. If he forced himself to do so, he was afraid that it would affect his injuries. Even if he managed to catch up with the journey, he was afraid that the gains would not make up for the losses in the end. As for Qin Wang, his injuries were even more severe than Xiaoyang's. Asking him to move the Flowing Cloud Realm was undoubtedly like forcing a duck onto a perch. Who knows? They might even do bad things out of good intentions and make things worse. Therefore, there was no other way around it. After all, no one dared to take the risk. Otherwise, the ones who would suffer would definitely be the millions of citizens of the Flowing Cloud world. On this point, Xiaoyang was also very strict about it. Half a month later, the realm of the gods sent a second king to help. After the king arrived in the God Realm, he received the God Emperor's instructions and hurried to the Flowing Cloud Realm. However, he had taken some detours, which delayed some matters. When Xiaoyang saw the king's arrival, his heart calmed down a lot, because he knew that with this almighty present, the Flowing Cloud Realm's journey could return to normal. As for himself, he didn't have to worry so much anymore. I didn't expect you to be so capable. Now, even my fourth brother isn't your opponent. The king couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Back then, when the king first met Xiaoyang, he was merely a 7th level ant compared to King Wu. As long as he was willing, he could casually crush him to death. But now, in less than 10 years, his cultivation was on par with his own. In fact, he was even stronger than him. Who would have thought that the world would develop so quickly? All of this could be said to be unexpected. No one could have predicted it. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, scratched his head and said, "Dawang, I was merely lucky." The king shook his head in denial. He understood his own younger brother very well. A win was a win. How could there be such a thing as luck? Therefore, this was just an excuse. It was indeed a good thing for young people to be humble. However, at their level, if they were humble, others might misunderstand and think that they were weak and easy to bully. Of course, this was all based on a situation that they didn't know. The king was still very clear about this little fellow's temperament. If you were really lucky, that brat would have run to me and complained that it was unfair. The king smiled bitterly. When Xiaoyang heard this, he was stunned for a moment. He did not expect Qin Wang to have such a side to him. It was truly unexpected. Although Qin Wang was one of the 9 great martial emperors back then, he wasn't a god. He was just a human. You truly know how to give people pleasant surprises. Seems like our divine realm has gained a powerful ally this time around. The king said with a smile. Xiaoyang's strength was even stronger than Qin Wang's. In that case, the fighting strength that he brought to the alliance was also very impressive. It could be said that Qin Wang was the vanguard of the plan back then. Now, Xiaoyang had become an even better candidate. Soon after, the two of them chatted about their daily lives and talked about some unimportant things. When Xiaoyang asked about Ziying's situation again, the atmosphere suddenly froze. This matter became a knot in the king's heart. Up until now, Ziying had yet to come out of the tomb of the gods. He was afraid that he wouldn't have another chance in the future. Thinking of this, the king's heart felt uncomfortable. Because of this, the conversation between them parted on bad terms. The king asked Xiaoyang to recuperate in peace. Then he took on the responsibility of promoting the flowing cloud boundary and took turns with Princess Mingzhu. Xiaoyang sat on the Rotten chair, and his heart was also filled with displeasure. Although Ziying wasn't mature enough and was a little arrogant, her nature wasn't bad. He didn't expect that she would become a sacrifice in the tomb of the gods. However, Xiaoyang still had a trace of hope in his heart. Maybe Ziying was just being playful, and that was why she didn't come out. Or maybe she encountered something like Ji Fei. Maybe after 1,000 years, she still had the chance to come out. In the end, these were all just guesses. If she couldn't come out of the tomb of the gods for more than 10 years, the outcome would be very obvious. The reason for this was also hard to figure out. Sometimes joys and sorrows came so suddenly that caught people off guard. Chapter 2159. With the addition of Dawang, this huge project was once again on the right track. Due to the fact that this senior was more experienced, the speed had also increased by quite a bit. As for Xiaoyang, he could completely be a hands-off shopkeeper and recuperate with peace of mind. If he had nothing to do, he would sit in his small courtyard and rest. When he had an idea, he would give some pointers to Xiao Man's cultivation so that she could raise her cultivation level in the shortest amount of time. After all, as she went to the middle world, it would be difficult for her to have the ability to protect herself with her current condition. Moreover, Xiao Man's aptitude was not bad. Xiaoyang did not want this girl to delay all of this just because of him. As Xiaoyang gave more and more pointers, Xiao Man was also very smart. She quickly understood the true meaning behind it. After a few days, there were already signs of a breakthrough, and she went into seclusion again. As for Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai, they also began to report some important matters to Xiaoyang. Of course, it was more about the entire drifting cloud realm's view of the god realm and their ability to accept it. Due to the initial hype and the publicity of many almighties, many people did not reject it. On the contrary, many people wanted to see what the outstanding people of the 3,000 small worlds looked like. How could they be so unforgettable? It could be said that many people had only heard of the god realm but had not seen it with their own eyes. However, all of this was about to become a reality. How could they not look forward to it? As they got closer to the god realm, countless cultivators became more and more excited. This was because what they saw was an infinitely beautiful future. At the same time, some friends began to visit, such as Baijian and Luoyang. Their world had already settled down, and they had some free time, so they came to the drifting cloud realm. When everyone saw Xiaoyang again, they had mixed feelings in their hearts. Back then, which one of them had a higher cultivation than Xiaoyang? But now they were all left far behind. This made them sigh with emotion. As for Lei Dingtian, he did not come. Moreover, the hatred between them did not seem to be forgotten because of what happened in the divine tomb. Now that Lei Dingtian could not do anything to Xiaoyang, there was no need for him to come again. At the very least, there was no way for him to take revenge for his blood feud. According to Bai Jian, Lei Dingtian had already begun his closed-door training. It seemed like he had been affected by the news that Xiaoyang had become the 10th martial emperor, and thus wanted to become the 11th martial emperor. His intentions could be said to be very clear. However, it wasn't an easy task to accomplish. After all, the affairs of the world were unpredictable. No one knew what would happen next. At least for Lei Dingtian, it would not be easy for him to let go of that grudge. Even though his temperament was already extremely good, there were many things that could not be completely denied with a few words. A month later, in the second year and third month of the new era, the flowing cloud realm successfully arrived at the God realm. King De and Princess Mingzhu were in charge of the border matters. Xiaoyang watched from the side. If there was anything that needed help, he would lend a helping hand. Of course, the main reason he was standing there was to watch. He didn't want any accidents to happen when they were setting up the formation. He didn't want them to discover something that they shouldn't have discovered. The world spirit had long received news about Xiaoyang. Since Princess Mingzhu's arrival, she had hidden herself well. After the chaos caused by Su Changtian, the world spirit was even more aware of how sinister the human heart was. If she did not take precautions, the ones who would suffer would be herself and the entire world. After the chaos, the flowing cloud realm was already weak. Now that it had finally welcomed its second spring, its momentum was even stronger than before, and it was even a little weak. If it succeeded, then it would be a colossus. If it failed, then it would be beyond redemption. Even though their relationship was very good now, under the temptation of huge benefits, it might collapse because of this. One must always be vigilant against others. Luckily, everything went very smoothly, and there was not the slightest bit of mistake. 3 days later, the flowing cloud realm and the God realm successfully connected. Of course, this connection was forcefully locked by the formation, and it was not the fusion of the two worlds. If the worlds were to fuse, then fate and other things would also be shared. Obviously, the God realm would not do such a thing. Once it was carried out, then the fate that belonged to the God realm would definitely flow to the other 3 worlds. At that time, they might suffer a huge loss. Furthermore, they were only allies, and it was not the fusion of the worlds. After everything was settled, King De brought Princess Mingzhu and the rest to leave the flowing cloud realm and return to the God realm to report. Xiaoyang also immediately ordered for everyone to not step foot into the God realm before they advanced to a middle world, so as to avoid any trouble. After all, the most important thing now was to advance to a middle world. At that time, if there were too many people from the flowing cloud realm going to the God realm, it might cause some trouble. At that time, even if it was a small matter, once there were too many, it would be extremely terrifying. Mu Yang, Chu Taiyin, and the rest immediately started to carry out the order, and also strictly ordered their disciples to not take half a step out of the flowing cloud realm, so as to avoid any trouble. At this crucial time, they still had to be careful with their words and actions. The alliance had just been confirmed, and it was still in a very fragile state, so they had to be careful. Although to the flowing cloud realm, being connected to the God realm was a big matter, they still had to be careful. The God Emperor had an incomparably broad mind, so to others it might be an unknown. The human heart was unpredictable. Xiaoyang had progressed too quickly, and at that time he had offended some people in the God realm, so it was inevitable that some people with ulterior motives would make some trouble. The other worlds also started to be careful with their words and actions. other than the few outstanding disciples who had relations with the other worlds. They would not casually move around. Even Bai Jian, Luo Rong, and the rest had returned to their own worlds. As for Ji Fei, he had steeled his heart to join the flowing cloud realm and did not return. Regarding this, Xiaoyang could only take things as they came, and there was no way to persuade him. Regarding Ji Fei's joining, Xiaoyang's heart still had some estrangement. After all, he was not like Baldy and Qin Mingho, who would never meet his own world again. Chapter 2160. June of the second year of the Exian New Era. The entire drifting cloud realm began to calm down after the previous excitement. They knew very well that they could not afford any chaos in the face of the big picture. Therefore, everyone abided by their duties, and no problems arose. Meanwhile, the heavenly realm was fully prepared. The God Emperor had also sent out a message, inviting the almighties of the other three worlds to attend a meeting to discuss the matter of the ascension of the world. Xiaoyang thought about it and decided not to bring Sun Dishing and Sun Yukai along. Instead, he went alone. At such a critical moment, he still needed to show up personally. After arriving at the God Realm, everything became a walk in the park. When he arrived at the gates of God Capital, Unrivaled God was waiting for him to receive him. Unrivaled God led Xiaoyang to the imperial palace. Along the way, he cautiously told him about the things to pay attention to in this meeting. Although it was called a meeting, it was just a meeting of 10 martial emperors. Many of the previous details had already been finalized, and everything was ready to go. As for their meeting, it was only for the sake of final confirmation. Unrivaled God did not bring Xiaoyang directly to the meeting place. Instead, he went to the backyard where the God Emperor was. The God Emperor was playing chess with an old man that Xiaoyang did not recognize. Prime Minister Jiang Zhangqing was waiting on them. When he saw Xiaoyang, he smiled in greeting. Among the 3 kings, only King Qin was there. The other 2 kings seemed to have gone to entertain other guests. Brother Xiao, long time no see. How have you been? A few months ago, you didn't even show up. Everything big and small was left to Sun Dishing, the God Emperor said with a smile. The old man who was playing chess with the God Emperor snorted coldly. He thought that Xiaoyang was being too ostentatious. What was he trying to do by only showing up now? Please forgive me, God Emperor. After the great battle, I've been recuperating. That's why I was absent from the meeting. Moreover, the 2 from the Sun family are much better than I am in this regard, Xiaoyang replied with a smile. When the God Emperor heard this, he smiled and nodded. Previously, he also felt that it was inappropriate for Xiaoyang to send 2 sixth-order King Wu cultivators to attend the meeting. However, no matter who it was, the 2 of them would always respond appropriately. Even King Wu, who had 4 spiritual meridians, was only a guard and never spoke a word. In addition, his response and views were indeed very appropriate. Even Jiang Zhangqing felt that any one of those 2 people was on par with his ability to rule the country. It was just a pity that his cultivation level was low, so it was inevitable that some people's words carried little weight. If not for Mu Yang's protection, many people would not have taken him seriously. Are you looking down on the God realm? Sect Master Xiao, it really wasn't easy to invite you over. The old man laughed disdainfully. When Emperor Qin saw this, he frowned slightly. Could it be that this old fellow had forgotten how he had been beaten up previously? Did he think that he could do it again after some time? When Xiaoyang heard this voice, he couldn't help but frown because he felt that this voice was far too familiar. However, he couldn't quite put his finger on it at that moment. Instantly, even the God Emperor's expression turned ugly. He didn't expect the old Prime Minister to have such a temper. May I ask if Senior was the mastermind who instructed Wei Beixin to kill me back then? Suddenly, Xiaoyang remembered and asked in a low voice. At this moment, Emperor Qin's lips curled into a smile. This was because he felt that there was going to be a good show to watch. The God Emperor didn't say anything and just laughed. On the other hand, Jiang Zhangqing was a little worried. He was naturally present at the plot back then, so he immediately said, Fellow Taoist Xiao, it's all in the past. Let it be. They had already come this far, so it wouldn't be good if they caused any more trouble. So what if I did? It's a pity that Wei Beixin didn't succeed and allowed you to succeed. The old prime minister berated. He thought about how he had paid an extremely heavy price back then, and how he had lost countless assets as compensation. Even his most beloved disciple had fallen in cultivation and lost his position as one of the 4 divine generals. How could he not feel hatred in his heart? Now that Xiaoyang had actually dared to ask him back, how could he tolerate it? This was the God realm, his territory. What right did an outsider like him have to be so arrogant and impudent? Since Senior is so sincere, then it's easy to talk about it, Xiaoyang said with a smile. Instantly, the atmosphere changed greatly. It could be said that swords were drawn and bows were drawn. A great battle was about to erupt. Jiang Zhangqing originally wanted to mediate, but when he realized that the God Emperor was leisurely drinking tea, he stopped himself. Emperor Qin was looking forward to it. He wanted to see what kind of trouble this little fellow could cause in the God Realm's territory. So what? The old prime minister said with a cold smile. This was the imperial palace and under the God Emperor's nose. How could he dare to make a move? Nothing, Xiaoyang said with a calm smile. Hearing this, the old prime minister's face couldn't help but become even more smug. Even if you've broken through to the martial emperor realm and become the unprecedented 10th martial emperor, so what? In front of the God realm's thighs, your slender arms are nothing. However, in the next moment, the old prime minister's expression changed drastically. This was because he felt an extremely terrifying power coming toward him. When he saw it, Xiaoyang moved like lightning and appeared in front of him in the blink of an eye. Boom! The old prime minister couldn't dodge the punch in time. He was caught off guard by this sudden attack and was sent flying. Back then, you hit me with a palm. Now, I'm returning the favor with a punch. We're even now, Xiaoyang said and clapped his hands as if nothing had happened. Everything seemed so casual, as if it was as simple as talking. The old prime minister stood up shakily. His internal organs had been shattered by this punch. This guy who didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth had gone too far. Such a sudden attack didn't follow any of the rules of the underworld. He had originally looked down on this bumpkin, but he didn't expect him to be such a character. What a joke! Brat, how dare you commit such a crime in the God realm? Do you not care about the rules of the God realm? The old prime minister shouted hysterically. The pain from his internal organs almost made him lose his mind. How dare this person humiliate him? Chapter 2161. Xiaoyang looked indifferent when he heard the prime minister's rebuke. In any case, his character is like this. Since you set a trap for me back then when you have the chance, you will naturally return the favor in full. However, the old prime minister's roar was of little use. The divine emperor and Emperor Qin seemed to have turned a deaf ear to it. They didn't listen at all. It could be said that this situation was within their expectations, and the emperor god had tacitly agreed to it. Jiang Zhangqing sighed helplessly when he saw his master being beaten up. He was such a shrewd person. Why did he become so muddle-headed when he was old? At the same time, Jiang Zhangqing was even more shocked. How long had it been since Xiaoyang stepped into the martial emperor realm? He could actually force the prime minister, who had been in the martial emperor realm for almost 10,000 years, back with a single punch. How terrifying was his strength! Immediately, Jiang Zhangqing's mind calmed down. Since Emperor Qin had lost to him, it was normal for the prime minister to lose to him. Prime Minister, I'm sure our friends from the Jinxin and Yangshua realms have arrived. Go ahead and catch up with them, the emperor god said with a smile as he took a sip of tea. When the prime minister heard this, the anger in his heart had yet to subside. Just as he was about to explode, he realized that Jiang Zhangqing was giving him a look. In the end, he could only accept the order and leave. Previously, the prime minister had used his status to make things difficult for Xiaoyang. That time, the Emperor God was already furious. Now, if he continued to act this way, the relationship between the monarch and his vassal would become even worse because of him taking advantage of his seniority. But today, he would remember this punch in his heart. After the old prime minister left, the atmosphere became a lot more relaxed. Emperor God, please forgive me. I'm just like that, Xiaoyang said with a smile. The Emperor God waved his hand and said, You should quit while you're ahead. Don't take it for granted. Xiaoyang smiled. They had a tacit understanding of what had happened. From the start of the conflict, the God Emperor had looked indifferent. He had not said a single word, which meant that he had tacitly approved of his actions. As long as it wasn't too overboard, it was within the acceptable range of the God Emperor. Of course, if they went too far, they would lose face and the God Emperor would no longer be able to protect them. Let's get down to business. I heard from Fourth Brother that when he fought with you, he felt that there was something wrong with the flow of your qi. Furthermore, that girl, Ming Zhu, also said that she was especially jealous when she fought with you. What exactly is going on? The Divine Emperor asked. This was also the reason why the Divine Emperor had summoned Xiaoyang alone this time around. How big of a deal was the advancement of a mid-stage world? Naturally, he wanted to smooth out all the problems and resolve them. Even if the God Emperor hadn't asked, Xiaoyang would have told him anyway. After all, honesty was the key to the continuation of the alliance. I am the 10th King Wu, and I am not tolerated by the 3,000 small worlds. I'm sure the God Emperor knows how much fate there is in the small worlds, Xiaoyang said with a smile. When the God Emperor heard this, he nodded slightly. Then, his expression became much more serious. If that's the case, it's not hard to explain. Princess Mingzhu is the person chosen by the 3,000 small worlds. Therefore, she is the heavenly way of the 3,000 small worlds. As for me, I am the anomaly that has gone against the heavenly way. Naturally, I will be destroyed, Xiaoyang said. When the God Emperor heard this, he already understood what was going on. However, it was also because of this that he was even more confused. Therefore, in the 3,000 small worlds, the contribution I can make is very limited. Once the power I use surpasses King Wu's, I will inevitably attract the heavenly punishment lightning tribulation and be suppressed by the 3,000 small worlds, Xiaoyang said and sighed helplessly. Immediately, everyone's expressions changed. Emperor Qin was in disbelief. This was because, although Xiaoyang was a martial emperor, he couldn't use the power of a martial emperor. Of course, this wasn't the main point. The main point was that he had lost. When Emperor Qin thought of this, he felt an inexplicable discomfort in his heart. If Xiaoyang had used his full power, how many more attacks would he have been able to block? The Divine Emperor laughed heartily and said, That makes sense. The God Emperor couldn't figure out what had happened previously. Now, everything had become clear. In his heart, he knew that he had not misjudged this time. If Xiaoyang could do this without using his full power, how terrifying would he be when he could display the full power of a martial emperor? Just by thinking about it, the God Emperor already had an answer. Xiaoyang, the God Realm has treated you well, right? The God Emperor asked with a smile. Xiaoyang nodded and immediately understood. He said, Don't worry, God Emperor. I am clear about gratitude and grudges. Naturally, I won't be an ungrateful person. Good. Then, let's go to the alliance meeting. The God Emperor laughed and stood up. Emperor Qin immediately walked in front to lead the way. In his heart, he already knew the attitude of both parties. There were some things that didn't need to be too obvious. For example, Xiaoyang had reached an agreement with the God Realm. Even if he couldn't unleash his full power, it didn't matter. The God Realm would take care of him. Correspondingly, once he went to the middle world and encountered trouble, Xiaoyang would have to fulfill his duty as an ally and help each other. There couldn't be any mistakes. This was a tacit understanding. The God Emperor was the Emperor of the God Realm, and Xiaoyang was the Lord of the drifting Cloud Realm. No matter where they were equal. If there was a difference, it would be that the god realm's overall strength was much stronger than the drifting cloud realms. Emperor Qin, on the other hand, had already closed himself off. He felt that he had lost to Xiaoyang because he wasn't strong enough. However, he didn't expect the gap between them to be so huge. Xiaoyang hadn't even used his power as a martial emperor, and he had already defeated him. In a short while, the group arrived at a large hall. Jiang Zhangqing stopped at the door and didn't move forward. The three of them entered the large hall. There were already 7 people sitting opposite each other and chatting. Those who could sit in this large hall to discuss matters were all martial emperors. Without such a cultivation level, one wouldn't have the right to set foot in here. Even Jiang Zhangqing didn't have the right. When the 3 of them entered, everyone's gazes were directed at them. Of course, they were more curious about the background of this young man who had defeated Princess Mingzhu and Emperor Qin. Upon closer inspection, they didn't see anything unusual. He didn't have 3 heads and 6 arms. Chapter 2162. Xiaoyang knew most of the people present. For example, he was familiar with Princess Mingzhu and Prince Da. Although he had some conflicts with King Zhao and the old Prime Minister, they could be considered acquaintances. As for the woman sitting next to Princess Mingzhu, she was astonishingly beautiful. She must be the God Empress. And the white-haired man with sharp eyebrows was the ancestor of the Sword Heart World, Li Fengmu. The other person with snow-like pupils was naturally a mighty figure of the Sun Snow World. It could be said that among the 4 worlds, only the people of the Sun Snow World had the most obvious characteristics. One could see clues from their eyes. The name of the mighty figure of the Sun Snow World was Luo Ji. He was the youngest of the older generation. Later on, Han Jingming fell, and Princess Mingzhu was no longer his to fill the gap. "Greetings, seniors," Xiaoyang said as he cupped his hands and performed a Jianghu salute. Everyone smiled and nodded one after another, indicating that they had accepted. Li Fengmu and Luo Ji both had a good impression of Xiaoyang, because in the Tomb of the Gods, if it weren't for his efforts to turn the tide, their most outstanding juniors might have all been buried in there. They could still distinguish this little bit of affection. Therefore, it was meaningless to suddenly have an additional ally. It was also because of Xiaoyang. Of course, Li Fengmu of the Sword Heart World thought even more highly of Xiaoyang. The reason was because of Bai Jian. Xiaoyang and Bai Jian could be said to have gone through life and death together twice. How strong was such a friendship? Heroes indeed come from the young. Good boy. Li Fengmu was not stingy with his praise. The God Emperor sat on the main seat and said, "Everyone, let's talk about this later. Let's settle the important matters first." Everyone immediately shut their mouths. They didn't say anything else and took their seats. Let's not talk about small talk. Let's talk about a few important matters first. The first is some problems we will face when the world is upgraded, the God Emperor said solemnly. Everyone listened attentively. Even though there were some conflicts between them, they had completely let it go at this point. I've read about it in an ancient book. 3,000 small worlds and 3,000 medium worlds. In other words, if we want to become a medium world, we must pull down a world, said the Divine Emperor. Immediately, everyone's expression became much more serious. They naturally understood the meaning behind this. When the time came, it was inevitable that they would have to go to war with a medium world. At that time, whoever won would be able to stay in the middle world, and whoever lost would be able to stay in the small world. However, wasn't it a little too difficult for a top small world to contend with a medium world? Of course, you don't have to worry. Survival of the fittest is the same principle in this world. When the time comes, the medium world we will be fighting against will be the weakest among the 3,000 medium worlds. If everyone can work together, it's not like we don't have a chance of winning. The Divine Emperor laughed. Furthermore, in the Emperor God's opinion, the probability of success was extremely high, because they had prepared for this for so long, and there were many people with outstanding strength. as long as they could defeat the other party's top fighting strength one by one. Victory would be in their hands. As for how strong the opponent is, we still don't know. However, we can only fight with our lives on the line, said the Divine Emperor. Everyone nodded in succession. When this plan was proposed, since they had chosen to go together, they had naturally made such preparations. Since everyone has a plan, then I'll talk about the upgrade, said the Divine Emperor. This had already been decided a long time ago. What they used was the Divine Travel Great Formation passed down from the God Realm as a basis to communicate with the 3,000 worlds and upgrade their worlds. 3 months ago, they had already started to set up the Divine Travel Great Formation. They had also completed the last wave yesterday, which was why today's alliance meeting was held. The only reason he brought it up now was to confirm and finalize it once more. This was a grand plan that the Divine Emperor had planned for thousands of years. Naturally, it couldn't be rushed. Even if it had been prepared long ago, it had to be confirmed again and again. This time, I will make some changes to the arrangement, said the Divine Emperor in a deep voice. When everyone heard this, they were stunned for a moment. Wasn't it a little too hasty to make changes now? The original plan was to let Ming Zhu go to the drifting cloud realm to help. However, considering that they have not been in the martial emperor realm for long and lack experience, I arranged for King to watch over there to prevent any mistakes. As for the main body of the God realm, I'm afraid I'll have to trouble you to help, said the Divine Emperor with a smile. The arrangement that had been made long ago was suddenly changed, but it was still within his control. However, the old Prime Minister frowned. He felt that there was something fishy about the Divine Emperor changing the plan after meeting Xiaoyang. Suddenly, the old Prime Minister looked at Xiaoyang abruptly. He thought of an extremely ridiculous possibility. Immediately, he gave up on this idea. If Xiaoyang was just deliberately mystifying and had not stepped into the martial emperor realm, how could he have sent him flying with one punch? Previously, the Qin Emperor's defeat could be said to be a deliberate attempt to create momentum. However, after personally experiencing the power of the Qin Emperor, he could no longer refute it. I have no problem, said the old Prime Minister through gritted teeth. The Divine Emperor nodded in satisfaction. Everything was under his control. That was the best course of action. Then Li Fengmu and Luo Ji also expressed that there were no problems, and that they would listen to the Divine Emperor's arrangements. They knew too little about the advancement of the world. It could be said that since they had chosen to believe in the Divine Emperor from the beginning, they could only listen to his arrangements. Let's begin, said the Divine Emperor in a deep voice after explaining many details. When everyone heard this, they slammed one hand on the table at the same time. The auras of the 9 martial emperors were completely released at this moment. Because of this, the 9 powers entangled with each other. Suddenly, rays of mysterious light shot out continuously. 9 was the ultimate number, and the 9 martial emperors were the ultimate number that could be nurtured in the 3,000 small worlds. The most basic condition for the advancement of the world was for the 9 martial emperors to gather and raise their own small worlds to the level of a medium world. Only then could it be carried out. The 3,000 small worlds would sense each other and use the mysterious way of heaven to compare the 2 worlds. The winner takes all. The Divine Travel Grand Array was set up to make the world more stable, so that the original world would not be damaged. Xiaoyang felt the power of the Great Path whizzing past. Chapter 2163. At the end of the first year of the new era, the promotion of a world was recorded in the history books of the Drifting Cloud Realm. To the Drifting Cloud Realm, this was definitely a qualitative change. This was because they had succeeded. Under the efforts of an almighty, the 3,000 small worlds had been promoted to 3,000 medium worlds. However, this did not allow people to be sure whether they had succeeded or not. This was because no one knew what kind of changes would occur after the world had been promoted. What they knew now was that they could not be sure that the world had been promoted. However, there were some substantial changes that caused everyone to have doubts in their hearts. They could not be sure and could not figure it out. Even Xiaoyang was very confused. This was because everything that had happened made him very depressed and puzzled. He originally wanted to ask the world spirit what had happened. However, it seemed to have fallen into a deep sleep again. He could not sense it at all. This made Xiaoyang feel very helpless. Although he could be said to be very knowledgeable, he did not have the slightest understanding of this matter. Otherwise, why would he choose to form an alliance with the God Realm? The main reason was that he did not know anything about this matter. Therefore, he was very passive now. The reason why they felt that they had succeeded was very simple. Whether it was the drifting cloud realm or the God Realm, after appearing in this space, the land had undergone a huge change. It had become more solid than before. At the same time, the fate that they possessed had also undergone a subtle change. It was no longer like before, where martial emperors were limited. Even if you had reached that step, it had already become a wall that blocked you, making it impossible for you to take half a step forward. However, what they were facing now was a smooth road. The traction on the land had also become stronger. If they wanted to fly now, they could only do so after stepping into King Wu's realm. It could be said that the entire world had undergone a qualitative change. However, Xiaoyang had also taken the initiative to explore. He wanted to see the surrounding worlds to confirm whether they had been promoted to 3,000 medium worlds. However, he realized that no matter where he went, it was as if he had taken a big detour and returned to the starting point. He could not find where the other worlds were at all. Even the God Emperors were at a loss as to what to do about this situation. During this period of time, there were also many martial emperors who went out to explore the surrounding situation. But in the end, they all returned in disappointment. Because they didn't find any substantial breakthroughs, they could only feel depressed in the end. On the other hand, there was movement in the realm of the gods. Prime Minister Jiang Zhangqing and the leader of the 4 great divine generals, Duandong Shui, had already sensed the barrier and were about to step into the realm of martial emperor. Some almighty cultivators in the Sun Snow world and the Sword Heart world also sensed it. But when would they be able to reach the emperor realm? That was still a problem. On the other hand, the Flowing Cloud world was still calm and peaceful. However, the cultivation of the younger generation had improved by leaps and bounds in this short half a year, leaving one speechless. There was another reason why Xiaoyang was able to confirm that he had arrived at the middle world. He no longer felt the suppression from the 3,000 small worlds. Moreover, some people showed signs of breaking through. As a result, they were no longer in the 3,000 small worlds. However, Xiaoyang couldn't figure out why the situation was still like this. This was because they seemed to be trapped in a strange space and couldn't explore a wider territory. The battle that was recorded in the records didn't happen, and the law of survival of the fittest didn't seem to be applied to them. As a result, it made people feel that it was even more strange. Or could it be that there was a mistake when they were operating the formation, which resulted in this situation? During this period of time, there were many almighty cultivators in the realm of the gods who were flipping through the ancient books, hoping to find some clues. However, the final result disappointed them. This was because they didn't get the answer that they wanted. The legacy had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. In addition to some unforeseen events in the past, there were some ancient books that were lost, and some important things that weren't recorded. It seemed to be reasonable. However, everyone's mind was still very active, and they wanted to know what was going on. After all, they didn't know what was going on, and it made them feel a little nervous. If he didn't know what was going on, he might bring about a fatal disaster. It was hard to say. Therefore, how could they not be careful? The world was unpredictable, and no one knew what changes would happen next. If they could know in advance and deal with it, they could at least reduce a lot of risks. However, no matter how much effort they put in, they couldn't get a satisfactory result in the end. In this sealed world, many almighty cultivators were panicking. Because this news hadn't been leaked, those who weren't core figures didn't know the reason, and they were still in a state of joy. Of course, because of the substantial changes, many people didn't have time to figure out more problems. Half a year had passed, and they still knew nothing about this world. Although they hadn't given up on exploring, the more time passed, the more panic they felt. This feeling was very passive. Some people suggested that they were just worrying about nothing, but this didn't make them feel at ease. As for what was going on, everyone was thinking. They had all sorts of guesses, but none of them had the experience of a world leveling up, so they still didn't know anything. They could only carry on. This feeling of helplessness made many people understand that as long as they were powerful enough, everything could be solved. If they weren't powerful enough, they would be at the mercy of others, and they wouldn't even be able to fight back. Xiaoyang sat on top of the North Light City's city wall. Looking at the dark sky, he couldn't help but sigh helplessly. The two people standing next to him were Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin. It could be said that, apart from Xiaoyang, the two of them were the most powerful almighties in the flowing cloud world. Right now, Chu Taiyin had reached the peak of King Wu's cultivation and had a great chance of breaking through to the martial king realm. Xiaoyang sighed. Things have changed with the passage of time. Who would have thought that we would be troubled by this small world? Xiaoyang also tried to break through the restrictions, but it was to no avail. Chapter 2164. Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin both smiled bitterly. They could not do anything about the current situation. During this time, Mu Yang had found many ancient books to read. However, this was the first time the drifting cloud realm had experienced a world upgrade. There were no records of it. As a result, Mu Yang ended up with nothing. He could not do anything about it. He could only wait quietly for an answer. So what if there was no answer? Now that they had come this far, there was no turning back. As such, no matter how worried you were, it was just a joke. The saying of being vigilant in times of peace was true. However, sometimes when you overdid something, the meaning behind it would change. In fact, it would even make people feel that you were being unreasonable. As such, Mu Yang ultimately stood on the side of worrying about nothing. Of course, from his point of view, even if this was a scheme, you were already in it and did not know anything about it. What could you do? There was nothing you could do. You could only wait for everything to happen. Of course, this could just be a small mistake. There was no other possibility. Sometimes it was not necessarily a good thing to think too much. I heard that the Sword Heart Realm is about to have a second martial emperor. Xiaoyang did not continue to dwell on this issue. He sighed. Hearing this, Mu Yang shook his head helplessly. He naturally understood the meaning behind Xiaoyang's words. Ever since the world upgraded, there were two people in the God realm who were about to step into that realm. It was only a matter of time. Of course, the God realm was one of the 3,000 small realms. They could not be compared. However, the other realms could still be compared. Although they were allies, sometimes if one's strength was not strong enough, then the right to speak would naturally be a lot lower. Although Xiaoyang had an impressive battle record, they did not dare to be careless. After all, everyone's top powers were constantly growing stronger, and Xiaoyang was the only one in the drifting cloud realm. It was inevitable that it would be difficult for him to do it alone, especially when some small fry who didn't know the inside story created some misconceptions and stirred up some trouble. It would be inevitable that they would have a headache. I might need some more time. I've just formed my 5th spirit vein. It won't be easy for me to sense the barrier, Mu Yang said with a bitter smile. When the world leveled up, Mu Yang had already comprehended it. Although he knew that the more small spiritual veins he had, the heavier the burden of breaking through to the martial royal realm would be, he still felt that he could give it a try. After all, there were times when a person needed to have dreams. What if it came true? Chu Taiyin also laughed bitterly and said, I've only just reached the peak of King Wu. How can I compare to those old fellows? Xiaoyang also smiled helplessly. This was indeed the case. However, he had already sensed some subtle changes in the emotions of the other worlds. The only way to shut those half-baked people up was to tell them that the strength of the flowing cloud realm was not weak either. In terms of the number of experts, they were not much less than them. However, those people did not have such thoughts. In fact, a few days ago, a few cultivators from the God realm had come and caused some unhappiness. If Sun Yu Kai hadn't handled it properly, there might have been a bigger mess. Once the matter was blown out of proportion, it would not be good for anyone. After all, they had worked together to achieve such a big thing. No matter who it was, they would not want to see it collapse. However, sometimes small things were so annoying that people could not help themselves. As for Ji Fei, I think he's showing signs of a breakthrough, Muyang said with a heavy tone. Chu Taiyin shook her head and said, although he is indebted to Lord Shao, he is still from the Sun-Snow realm. Although he has decided to join the Flowing Cloud realm, he can't compare to Baldi and Chen Mingho. Although Baldi and Chen Mingho were also from the outside world, they were no longer connected to their original world. However, Ji Fei was different. If he wanted to return to the Sun-Snow realm, it would only take him a few days. Moreover, everything he had was in the Sun-Snow realm. He had ties there. When the time came, he might be forced to go back with just a word. As such, they had no choice but to think carefully. Xiao Yang nodded slightly. He had always been against Ji Fei's decision to join the Flowing Cloud realm. After all, this was not a small matter. Did the God realm say anything? Mu Yang asked worriedly. Right now, the only thing they could rely on was the God realm. After all, whether it was in terms of strength or foundation, the God realm was the strongest. Xiao Yang shook his head helplessly and said, however, I heard that the God Emperor has broken through his shackles. I'm afraid his cultivation has increased. When Mu Yang heard this, his eyebrows relaxed. The higher the God Emperor's cultivation, the more advantageous it would be for them. As long as they were strong enough, they would have the ability to protect themselves. This was a principle that had not changed since time immemorial. At least for now, their alliance was still in the honeymoon stage. Naturally, they would not fall out with each other. I can only hope that he will be able to comprehend something after his cultivation level increased. Otherwise, if this continues, I will go crazy. Xiao Yang smiled bitterly and said helplessly, after all, no one wanted to continue living like this. If they could figure out the ins and outs of the matter, then everything could be discussed. Even if there was a shocking secret, they could still discuss and come up with a countermeasure. If it was really a blunt knife cutting your flesh, then that would be the scariest thing. If you lost your life without feeling any pain, then that would not be good. Death was not scary. However, if you did not even know how you died, then that would be the scariest thing. Suddenly, Xiao Yang's waist flashed with a trace of power. He flipped his hand and picked it up. It was the Pisces token. The God Emperor had given it to him when he was in the 3,000 small realms. When he saw the message, Xiao Yang could not help but raise his eyebrows. The corners of his mouth curled into a smile. The God Emperor has successfully broken through to the 3rd level of the Martial King realm. I did not expect him to have hidden his strength so deeply. Xiao Yang said with a bitter smile. Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin's faces were also filled with shock. Chapter 2165. After instructing Mu Yang and Chu Taiyin to patrol the drifting cloud realm, Xiao Yang headed to the God realm alone. When the God Emperor was in the 3,000 small worlds, he was already a 2nd-level martial king. Now that he knew about it, Xiao Yang could not help but be shocked. He had thought that he was invincible in the 3,000 small worlds after breaking through to the martial king realm. He did not expect the God Emperor, who had never fought, to be so powerful. There must be a reason why the God Emperor chose not to fight. He was also suppressed by the 3,000 small worlds, which was why he did not dare to fight. He had been staying in the palace all this time. Strictly speaking, a 2nd-level martial king did not belong to the 3,000 small worlds. Once one reached that level, they would be forced to ascend to the middle world. However, the God Emperor did not do that. He must have used some kind of method to deceive the heavenly secrets. Suddenly, Xiao Yang's expression couldn't help but change, because he couldn't help but have another thought. Could the change this time be related to the realm of an emperor god? However, this was something that could not be confirmed. The god emperor was an anomaly, and Xiaoyang was also an anomaly in the 3,000 small worlds. When two outliers gathered together and disrupted the laws of the 3,000 small worlds, it seemed to be a normal thing for an unforeseen event to occur. After thinking up to this point, Xiaoyang's heart began to feel uneasy. If that was really the case, then he and the God Emperor had really done something bad out of good intentions. Of course, as for the specifics of the situation, they might be able to come to a conclusion after some discussion. Of course, it would depend on what the God Emperor said. 3 days later, Xiaoyang arrived at the god's capital. Because of his identity as Lord Xiao and the Pisces token, no one stopped him along the way. Of course, after entering the palace, there were still some taboos. For example, there were guards following him wherever he went. When he arrived at the back garden, Xiaoyang saw the God Emperor sitting in front of an exquisite table, leisurely sipping tea. However, there was a trace of displeasure between his brows from beginning to end. Clearly, the God Emperor had also encountered a difficult problem. Otherwise, why would he make things difficult for them? For a moment, Xiaoyang's heart began to beat like a drum. The current situation was indeed a little tricky. What exactly was going on? He was still in a state of confusion. However, judging from the God Emperor's expression, one could tell that the situation was not optimistic. Beside the Divine Emperor was the old Prime Minister, who had been punched by Xiaoyang and had returned the favor. King Zhao was among them as well. He seemed to be worried as well. Lord Xiao. When the God Emperor saw that the guest had arrived, he stood up and cupped his fists. Seeing the God Emperor's attitude, the old Prime Minister and King Zhao didn't dare to be negligent. They stood up and cupped their fists in greeting. Xiaoyang returned the greeting with cupped fists. After exchanging some pleasantries, he sat opposite the Divine Emperor. Congratulations, God Emperor, for stepping into the Third Order Martial Emperor realm. Whether or not we can walk out with our heads held high in the future will all depend on the Divine Emperor's prestige, Xiaoyang said with a smile. The God Emperor shook his head and said, "This is nothing. We are allies to begin with. We share both honor and disgrace. Who knows, we might still have to rely on Brother Xiao in the future." Hearing these words, the old Prime Minister felt uncomfortable. He felt that this young lad had just gotten lucky. Was there a need to take him so seriously? On the other hand, King Zhao had a different opinion. Although Xiaoyang had taken first place in the realm of the gods' grand competition back then and hadn't landed in the hands of his son, King Zhao had a different opinion. However, he now admired Xiaoyang very much. If a person could occasionally accomplish something impossible, it could be due to luck. However, he had done it time and time again. It couldn't be as simple as luck. Let's cut to the chase. I wonder if you have discovered anything during these days? The God Emperor asked in a deep voice. This was something that had always been on their minds. Did you not sense anything after breaking through to the next realm? Xiaoyang asked and couldn't help but frown. At this moment, Xiaoyang understood that it was impossible to get any useful information from the God Emperor. I tried to stop suppressing my realm because I wanted to see if I could sense anything when I broke through to the next realm, or if I could cause any changes to the world to find clues. However, everything is calm and peaceful. The Celestial Emperor sighed helplessly as he spoke. Before doing this, the God Emperor's heart was also tormented. This was because he didn't know what kind of consequences his actions would bring. However, this level of unchanging made him even more impatient. Xiaoyang shook his head and said, "If that's the case, I'm afraid the changes this time aren't because of the two of us." Hearing this, the God Emperor nodded. Since the changes caused by the two of them had been completely ruled out, what exactly was going on? This was also a knot in their hearts. Could it be that the rules are just like that? They want us to adapt to the benefits brought by the medium world, giving us a buffer period to increase our strength, and then compete with the world we're going to fight? Xiaoyang said. This was also the possibility that Xiaoyang came up with after thinking about it for a long time. Hearing this, the God Emperor also felt that it made sense. However, this was just a guess after all. Of course, to him, this was also the most reasonable guess. After all, even the top talents of the 3,000 small worlds were still far from the bottom of the 3,000 medium worlds. If there were such rules and conveniences, it could be considered as giving them a chance. Let's hope so, the God Emperor said and sighed helplessly. If this guess was true, then they didn't have to worry too much. If it wasn't true, then the problems they would face in the future would be very severe. In the past, when they were in the 3,000 small worlds, they could sense some changes and they were very sensitive. But now they had lost this ability. They used countless angles to prove that they had left the 3,000 small worlds. But it was difficult to confirm that they had completed the promotion and arrived at the 3,000 medium worlds. I've read countless ancient books these days, but they are intermittent and can't be connected. However, one thing is certain, and that is when the God realm fell from the 3,000 medium worlds, there was indeed a battle with the small worlds. The reason we lost the battle was because the Almighties from the other world sneaked into the God realm to create trouble, the old Prime Minister said with a bitter smile. Chapter 2166. Xiaoyang and the God Emperor didn't think much of the old Prime Minister's words, because they had stopped listening to these things a long time ago. This was especially so for the God Emperor himself. He had flipped through the ancient books countless times, and even memorized many of the questions. However, speaking of which, the God realm had experienced a fall back then. However, they had never seen a rise in cultivation. As such, the exact situation was still a mystery. A lot of things were just guesses and assumptions to them. In the end, it was just like an illusion. It was definitely not an easy task to verify it. Moreover, they were also worried and fearful. They were afraid that the day they were verified would be the day of their doom. This kind of situation of not knowing anything was the most frightening, because the God Emperor and Xiaoyang had both been suppressed by the heavenly Tao. They naturally knew what this meant. If they were the slightest bit careless, they might fall into a bottomless abyss. Big brother, we don't have to be so pessimistic. After all, there are many things that need to be looked at positively. We are in a terrible state now. We are constantly in fear. This will cause a huge flaw in our mental state, King Zhao said after pondering for a long time. In King Zhao's opinion, since some things were difficult to be certain, why couldn't they be more optimistic? At least this way, they could maintain a good mental state. If a person's state of mind collapsed, it was hard to say what kind of flaws would appear. It might even have an impact on the future path of cultivation. The God Emperor nodded solemnly. How could he not understand the logic behind this? It was just that there were too many uncertainties. He couldn't help but be nervous. Bringing the God realm back to the middle world from the 3,000 small worlds took him a lot of effort and even thousands of years of planning. This could be said to be his lifelong wish, so he couldn't allow the slightest mistake to happen. Even if they appeared, they had to be killed in the shortest time possible. I agree with this point of view. Since there are clear records of this battle in the ancient books, we can now put our focus on training our troops. It's hard to say whether the current situation is a blessing or a curse, Xiaoyang agreed. Conflicts were conflicts, but in the face of the big picture, there was no room for ambiguity. In this aspect, Xiaoyang was also mentally prepared. The God Emperor nodded and said, "That's all we can do now." Everyone heaved a sigh of relief. As long as there was something to do, many problems would be solved. At the very least, there wouldn't be too big of a problem with their state of mind. Everything was still within their control. If he lived in fear and trepidation every day, it would indeed be a huge blow to his heart. Fellow Taoist Xiao, how are your preparations going? The Divine Emperor asked. Xiaoyang nodded with a smile and said, I got the main family to refine the explosive pill. A few days ago, I received news that there are already as many as 10,000 pills. As for the qi gathering, Dan, because the requirements are too high, I am the only one who can make it. Therefore, there are only a few hundred of them. After much consideration, Xiaoyang also felt that the explosive pill was the greatest support he could give to his family. He wasn't sure if the Xiao family could rise because of the explosive pill, but at the very least, this was enough for them to benefit greatly. Of course, these pills would be shared among the few worlds after they were refined and distributed uniformly. After all, the medicinal ingredients needed to be provided by each world. Now that they were sealed in this world, there were too many things they couldn't figure out. They could only do this for now. The God Emperor nodded with a smile and said, "It's already very good. I've troubled all of you these days." In the God Emperor's eyes, these tens of thousands of explosive pills were enough to let their divine realm suddenly have tens of thousands of King Wu level 9 experts. If it was just the increase of 1 or 2 people, it was indeed nothing much. But the increase of tens of thousands of people at the same time was not to be underestimated. As for the Qi gathering Dan, the God Emperor had seen it before. It was indeed very good. So much so that there were some young talents in the divine world, or even withered old people who had stepped into the 9th Order Martial King realm because of this spirit gathering pill. It was just that the supply of Qi gathering Dan could not meet the demand. This made the God Emperor feel rather helpless. Although the God Emperor also knew how to refine pills, his speed was too slow. This was also one of the things that the God Emperor admired about Xiaoyang. His efficiency in refining pills was incomparably terrifying. "You've done what you can. Now it's up to us," the God Emperor said. In this alliance, because of the explosive pills, the Flowing Cloud realm's responsibility was to refine pills and provide them to the various worlds. Of course, this was also the result after careful consideration. Although the Flowing Cloud realm had some top fighting strength, it was not enough. Most of the disciples were King Wu level 5 and level 6 experts. They were not enough in the divine realm, let alone in the middle world. Therefore, in the war, the divine realm was still the main force, with the Sword Heart realm and Sun Snow realm as support. As for the Flowing Cloud realm, it was wholeheartedly doing logistics. After talking for a while and settling some matters, Xiaoyang returned to the Flowing Cloud realm alone. He received news from the God Emperor that King Da, King Qin, and Princess Mingzhu were also in seclusion, beginning to break through to the 2nd level of Martial Emperor. Presumably, it wouldn't take long for him to succeed. In this way, the forces of the divine realm could be said to be truly monopolized. Even if the 3 worlds joined forces, it would probably be difficult to compare to the divine realm. Their positions in the alliance would naturally change according to the strength of their respective worlds. Regarding this, Xiaoyang also felt extremely pressured. The current Flowing Cloud realm in front of them was simply considered to have been weak for a long time. Although the God Emperor gave Xiaoyang very high treatment now, this was only for the time being. Who could say for sure whether there would be other changes as time passed? This was something that no one could say for sure. Because that battle had not come yet, it was a unity of will. When the time came, whether they would burn the bridge after crossing the river, no one could say for sure. Only by being prepared could one last. The world was ever-changing, and no one knew how big the changes would be in the future. The human heart was unpredictable and unpredictable. After returning to the Flowing Cloud realm, Xiaoyang stayed in his small courtyard to meditate and cultivate. Breaking through to a new realm was also a top priority for Xiaoyang. After 3 months, Xiaoyang finally received the response of the World Spirit.